I walked into divorce court ready to lose absolutely everything. My cheating husband wanted the house, the company, and even our two rescue dogs just to hurt me. My mother sat behind me and whispered the craziest advice of my entire life. She told me to give him everything. So I did. His family laughed out loud right there in the courtroom, never knowing the truth hidden in the paperwork would completely destroy them later. My name is Vanessa, 34 years old, and this is the story of how I let my arrogant ex-husband sign his own financial ruin. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart a toxic family who underestimated your intelligence. The sterile chill of the Chicago family courtroom seeped right through my tailored black blazer. It was a miserable Tuesday morning. Rain lashed against the high-arched windows, mirroring the cold and gray atmosphere that seemed to suffocate everyone inside the room. I stood near the heavy wooden benches, clutching my legal folder so tightly my knuckles turned white. I was trying desperately to maintain a neutral expression, to show no weakness in a room designed to strip you of your dignity. That is when I felt a hard, deliberate jab in my ribs. Beatrice, my soon-to-be ex-mother-in-law, had intentionally rammed the sharp corner of her heavy designer bag into my side as she squeezed past me to reach the gallery seating. She paused right next to me, adjusting her thick diamond tennis bracelet so the overhead fluorescent lights would catch the expensive stones. She leaned in close to my ear, her breath smelling of strong mints and bitter espresso. "The charity case is finally getting evicted," she hissed. Her voice was dripping with absolute venom and decades of old money arrogance. I kept my gaze fixed straight ahead, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. For 5 long years, Beatrice had made it her personal mission to remind me that I came from a hard-working middle-class background while her son Bradley was Chicago Gold Coast royalty. To her, I was never a partner or a daughter-in-law. I was just an unfortunate phase her son was going through, a commoner who had somehow tricked her way into their prestigious bloodline. I took my seat at the defense table next to my lawyer, Harrison. Across the wide center aisle at the plaintiff's table sat Bradley. At 35 years old, my husband looked like he had just stepped off the cover of a wealthy business magazine. He wore his custom-tailored Italian suit, like a suit of armor, leaning back in his heavy leather chair, with a smug, untouchable grin plastered across his perfectly groomed face. He was not looking at me with any trace of regret, sadness, or even anger for the decade we had spent together. He was looking at me like I was a minor accounting error he was finally paying someone to erase. Flanking him were 3 aggressive, high-priced lawyers. These were men who charged thousands of dollars an hour just to intimidate people like me into submission. They sat with their shoulders squared, arranging thick stacks of legal paper, treating this entire proceeding like a hostile corporate takeover rather than the heartbreaking dissolution of a marriage. The lead attorney, a man with cold eyes and a booming voice, stood up and began to list their outrageous demands for the judge to hear. His voice echoed off the dark wood-paneled walls as he read through the exact settlement terms Bradley required. First, Bradley demanded 100% ownership of our $2.5 million Gold Coast estate. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. I had spent years turning that massive empty house into a warm home. I picked out the tiles, planted the garden, and painted the walls while Bradley was out drinking with clients. Now he wanted to take it all and hand the keys to his mistress. Then came the business assets. The lawyer smoothly stated that Bradley required 100% total control and absolute equity of the tech investment firm we supposedly built together. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted copper just to keep from shouting my objections across the room. Bradley was the charming face of that company. He was the visionary who took clients to expensive steak dinners, played golf on Tuesdays, and shook hands at charity galas. But I was the forensic accountant who had secretly built the entire financial infrastructure from the ground up. I spent countless sleepless nights designing the complex algorithms, managing the convoluted ledgers, and ensuring the company actually functioned legally and profitably while he played the wealthy chief executive officer. Yet, according to his aggressive legal team, my contribution was negligible and easily replaced. Then came the final demand, the one designed purely to break my spirit and crush my heart. The lawyer looked down at his notes and formally requested that Bradley receive primary custody of our two rescue dogs, Buster and Luna. I felt the air leave my lungs. Bradley absolutely hated those dogs. He constantly complained about their shedding on his expensive rugs. He hired dog walkers so he never had to interact with them or take them outside in the cold. He once threatened to leave the front gate open so they would run away into the busy city streets just because one of them barked during his phone call. Asking for custody of Buster and Luna now was not about love or companionship. It was a cold, calculated move to take away the only living things in that massive house that I truly cared about. He wanted to watch me cry over the animals I had bottle-fed and rescued from the shelter. He wanted total victory. I could hear distinct rustling in the gallery seating directly behind me. Beatrice was not sitting quietly, as spectators are instructed to do. She had positioned herself right behind the wooden dividing rail, sitting shoulder to shoulder with Lexi. Lexi was Bradley's 23-year-old affair partner. She sat there loudly chewing gum, wearing a vibrant designer dress that Bradley had undoubtedly paid for using the company credit card I used to manage. Lexi looked incredibly young, incredibly naive, and incredibly arrogant all at once. She kept checking her reflection in her phone screen, treating the courtroom like a waiting room for an exclusive club. I heard Beatrice lean over to Lexi, speaking loud enough for her voice to intentionally carry to my table. "The house is going to look so much better once we strip out all of her cheap taste," Beatrice stage whispered, making sure I could hear every single syllable. Lexi giggled softly, a high-pitched, grating sound that echoed awkwardly in the quiet, solemn room. "We can finally turn that tacky home office into my content creation studio," Lexi whispered back, her voice full of entitlement. "I need good natural lighting for my brand deals, and her old desk is taking up all the good space." The judge, an older man with tired eyes, looked up from his paperwork and shot a warning glare toward the gallery, but Beatrice simply offered him a sweet, unapologetic smile and patted Lexi on the knee. They felt entirely above the law, above basic human decency, and above me. I sat there absorbing the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. They did not just want to divorce me. They wanted to erase my existence, claim my hard work as their own genius, and humiliate me publicly while doing it. The lead lawyer continued droning on about Bradley's entitlement to the marital assets, painting a picture of a brilliant man, burdened by an ungrateful, financially dependent wife. Bradley nodded along with the lawyer's words, adjusting his expensive tie, looking like a king waiting to be crowned. The injustice of it all burned in my throat. I had given my youth, my brilliant financial mind, and my unwavering loyalty to a man who saw me as nothing more than a stepping stone to his own greatness. And now, sitting in a room filled with his family's mocking laughter and his mistress's giggles, I was being asked to simply hand over the keys to my entire life. I remembered the nights I stayed up late balancing the company accounts while Bradley was out supposedly entertaining clients but actually entertaining Lexi. I remembered the way Buster would lay his head on my feet to keep me warm in the drafty office. Those dogs were my only comfort in a house that felt increasingly like a museum dedicated to Bradley's ego. The lawyer kept speaking, listing bank accounts I had opened, investment portfolios I had meticulously curated, and offshore bonds I had researched for months. Every single asset being claimed by Bradley was a direct result of my financial acumen. Yet the narrative being spun in the courtroom was that I was a gold digger trying to steal his hard-earned fortune. The sheer audacity of the lies made my hands shake. I looked over at Harrison, my attorney, who was calmly reviewing the settlement binder. He did not look angry or panicked. He looked like a man who knew a secret. And he did. Because despite the overwhelming weight of their demands, despite the mocking whispers from Beatrice and the smug smiles from Bradley, I was not actually the victim in this room. I was the architect of the very trap they were so eagerly walking into. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom absorbed the suffocating silence that followed the opposing counsel's ridiculous list of demands. The lead attorney finally sat down, adjusting his stiff white cuffs with an air of complete finality. All eyes in the room slowly shifted toward my side of the wide center aisle. The tension peaked thick and heavy, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. Outside, the Chicago rain continued to lash mercilessly against the high-arched windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished wooden floors. The judge leaned forward over his high mahogany bench. He peered down at us through his thick reading glasses, his expression a mask of profound judicial weariness. He cleared his throat, the deep sound echoing sharply in the cavernous, quiet space. He looked directly at my attorney Harrison, and then shifted his gaze to me. The judge asked if the defense wished to contest the terms presented by the plaintiff. He noted the highly unusual and aggressive nature of the demands, his tone implying that he had rarely seen such a lopsided agreement in his decades on the bench. He even offered a brief window for a recess if we needed to step out into the hallway to discuss a counteroffer or formulate a rebuttal against this blatant financial slaughter. I felt the intense, overwhelming pressure of the moment. Across the room, Bradley vibrated with eager anticipation. He wanted a fight. He wanted me to scream, to cry, to beg the court for a fraction of the life I had meticulously built for us over the last 10 years. He fed on dramatic conflict and thrived on watching people eventually submit to his absolute will. Beatrice shifted loudly in her seat behind him, her heavy floral perfume wafting across the aisle, completely overpowering the stale courtroom air. She was practically perched on the edge of the wooden pew, waiting for my spectacular emotional breakdown. I felt a gentle grounding pressure on the back of my wooden chair. My mother Miriam sat directly behind me in the first row of the gallery. She was a woman of fierce intellect and quiet, unwavering strength, having raised me single-handedly to never back down from a bully. She knew exactly what I was capable of accomplishing. Instead of crying or fighting, Miriam leaned forward until I could feel the warmth of her breath near my ear. Her voice was barely a whisper, completely masked from the opposing table, yet it carried the weight of absolute terrifying certainty. "Give it to him," she instructed softly, her tone completely devoid of fear. "Give him every single piece of it." Hearing my mother say those precise words solidified everything in my mind. The plan was officially in motion. There was no turning back now. Harrison, sitting perfectly still beside me, did not flinch or betray any surprise. He did not object to the judge. He did not ask for a recess to reconsider our strategy. Instead, Harrison slowly pushed the massive settlement binder forward across our table. The binder was incredibly thick, containing hundreds of pages of financial disclosures, property deeds, business valuations, tax returns, and custody arrangements. It was the physical manifestation of my entire adult life, bound in black leather and secured with heavy silver rings. Harrison opened it to the designated signature pages, smoothing the crisp white paper with the flat palm of his hand. He unclipped his expensive fountain pen and placed it gently right next to the signature line. The metallic click of the pen hitting the desk echoed loudly in the silent room. I knew my role perfectly. I had to play the part of the defeated, broken wife flawlessly. If Bradley or his aggressive lawyers suspected for a single second that I was willingly surrendering these massive assets, they would tear the agreement apart line by line to find out why. I let my shoulders slump forward physically, shrinking into my chair to appear small and entirely beaten. I forced my breathing to become shallow and rapid, perfectly mimicking the onset of a terrible panic attack. I lowered my head, letting my hair fall forward to shadow my face, completely hiding the absolute calculating coldness burning in my eyes. I reached out with a trembling hand to pick up the pen. I made sure my fingers shook just enough for Bradley to notice the erratic movement from his side of the room. Across the aisle, I heard Bradley let out a soft, triumphant sigh. He thought he had completely broken me. He thought he had won the ultimate victory. I pressed the sharp nib of the pen to the paper. The dark blue ink bled into the page. The first document was the quitclaim deed for the Gold Coast estate. By signing it, I was legally relinquishing all my rights, title, and interest in our $2.5 million home. I signed my name, letting my signature trail off weakly at the end, as if I lacked the physical strength to complete it. Next, was the comprehensive business transfer agreement. This document handed over 100% of my equity voting rights and financial claims to the tech investment firm I had built with my own bare hands. I signed it without hesitation. I signed away my beautiful home. I signed away my highly profitable company. I signed away my sweet loyal rescue dogs. Page after page, my forged weakness transferred every asset of real value into Bradley's sole possession. I played the victim so perfectly that even the court stenographer stopped typing for a moment to look at me with deep, genuine pity. I kept my head down, letting a single carefully orchestrated tear fall onto the mahogany table. As my pen lifted from the final page, the absolute silence of the courtroom was violently shattered. Beatrice actually laughed out loud. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle or a muffled sound of relief. It was a sharp, barking laugh of pure, unadulterated malice that bounced off the high ceiling. She did not care that she was in a formal court of law. She did not care about basic decorum or respect for the solemn legal process taking place. She had watched the so-called charity case sign away her entire life, and she simply could not contain her malicious joy. Lexi joined in, immediately giggling loudly and clapping her hands together excitedly like a spoiled child receiving a shiny new toy. Bradley beamed proudly, puffing out his chest and adjusting his suit jacket, looking around the room to ensure everyone was witnessing his absolute dominance over me. The plaintiff's lawyers leaned back in their expensive leather chairs, exchanging satisfied nods, mentally calculating the massive, undeserved bonuses they would soon extract from Bradley's newly inflated bank accounts. Harrison calmly collected the signed binder. He kept his face completely neutral as he stood up and walked toward the high bench. He handed the heavy document up to the clerk, who passed it respectfully to the judge. The judge adjusted his reading glasses and began to flip slowly through the pages meticulously, ensuring every single signature line was properly executed and witnessed. The entire room held its collective breath. Bradley watched the judge with hungry, eager eyes, desperate for the final legal validation of his crushing victory. Beatrice was practically vibrating in her seat, whispering excitedly to Lexi about hiring luxury interior decorators by the end of the week to strip the house of my presence and erase any memory of me. The rhythmic ticking of the large wall clock seemed to amplify with every agonizing second that passed. The judge reached the end of the main settlement agreement. Then his fingers turned the page to the final fatal section. Schedule C. The attachment. This was the document Harrison and I had spent grueling weeks carefully drafting, burying it deep within the dense, mind-numbing legalese of the massive financial disclosures. Bradley's arrogant, overpriced lawyers had clearly skimmed right over it, assuming it was standard boilerplate language regarding minor tax liabilities or routine indemnifications. They were too focused on securing the lucrative assets to properly analyze the severe world-ending liabilities attached to them. They were incredibly sloppy, driven entirely by their client's massive ego and their own greed, rather than careful, thorough legal strategy. I watched the judge intently. He was a seasoned legal professional who had seen thousands of bitter, contested divorce decrees cross his desk over the decades. His eyes scanned the dense text of Schedule C. I saw the exact moment his brilliant legal mind registered what he was actually reading. His reading glasses slipped slightly down his nose. His eyes widened just a fraction of an inch. He stopped turning the pages. He read the liability clause once. Then he read it again, much more slowly this time. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming almost unbearable for Bradley, who began to shift impatiently in his expensive leather chair, completely unaware of the devastating bomb sitting quietly on the judge's bench. The judge slowly lowered the heavy binder onto his desk. He looked over the top of his glasses, staring directly at the plaintiff's table. He looked at the high-priced lawyers who had completely failed to do their basic due diligence. He looked at Bradley, who was still grinning like an absolute fool. He looked at Beatrice, who was still smirking triumphantly in the gallery behind her son. For a brief, suspended moment, the judge shifted his gaze and made direct eye contact with me. I kept my face perfectly blank, betraying no emotion whatsoever. But I held his intense, searching gaze. The judge gave a microscopic shake of his head. It was a gesture so small, so remarkably subtle, that absolutely no one else in the room caught it. It was a gesture of profound disbelief at the sheer stupidity and hubris of the family sitting across from me. He recognized exactly what I had done. He saw the brilliant, devastating trap hiding in plain sight. They did not read it. They were so blinded by their toxic greed, so eager to strip me of everything I owned and rub my face in the dirt that they never bothered to read the fine print. They assumed my compliance was a sign of total weakness. They assumed my silence was a sign of absolute defeat. They never considered that the woman who meticulously built their complex financial empire would know exactly how to dismantle it using a single sheet of paper. Schedule C was not just a simple attachment. It was a financial death sentence carefully disguised as a routine legal disclosure. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel. He did not ask any further questions. He did not request clarification from Bradley's highly paid legal team. It was not his job to protect them from their own staggering arrogance. It was his job to execute the agreement as willingly signed by both consenting parties. He raised the gavel high in the air. The polished wood gleamed brightly under the harsh fluorescent lights. Bradley sat forward, practically panting for the final sound of his supposed victory. Beatrice clutched Lexi's arm in breathless anticipation, ready to celebrate my ultimate destruction. The gavel struck the sounding block with a loud, definitive crack that echoed like thunder against the wooden walls. The sound signaled the absolute end of my marriage. It signaled the legal transfer of my home, my business, and my life into Bradley's eager hands. But much more importantly, that single strike of the gavel legally bound Bradley and his entire family to the hidden, inescapable terms of Schedule C. The judge picked up his heavy ink stamp, pressed it firmly onto the final page of the document, and signed his name with a swift, fluid motion. The order was now final, binding, and completely irreversible under the law. They thought they had won the war, but they had just proudly signed their own ruin. And it was about to bury them. The Blacktown car dropped me off at the wrought iron gates of the Gold Coast estate just an hour after the gavel fell. The imposing limestone facade of the house stood tall against the gray Chicago sky. This was the sanctuary I had designed, financed, and meticulously maintained. Now it felt entirely like enemy territory. I took a deep breath, letting the icy wind from Lake Michigan steel my nerves, and pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. I only had 24 hours to pack my clothes, but the sheer chaos echoing from the main hallway told me the invasion had already begun. A loud, heavy thud echoed from the formal library down the hall. I dropped my empty suitcase by the entryway and walked toward the noise, my heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. I stepped into the library and froze. Lexi, wearing bright pink designer activewear, undoubtedly paid for by the corporate credit card I used to manage, was standing in the center of the room holding a thick black trash bag. She was systematically pulling my rare curated art books from the custom-built mahogany shelves and dropping them unceremoniously into the garbage. These were first editions I had spent years sourcing from independent dealers across Europe. "What are you doing?" I demanded, stepping fully into the room. Lexi did not even flinch. She dropped a heavy volume of Renaissance architecture into the plastic bag, letting out a loud, dramatic sigh. She turned to look at me, tossing her bleached blonde hair over her shoulder. "I am clearing out all this depressing junk," she said, her voice nasal and dripping with entitlement. "I need the space for my influencer lighting equipment. The ring lights and tripod stands take up so much room, and this dark wood is totally ruining my aesthetic. We are painting everything white by the weekend." I stepped forward, my hands balling into fists at my sides. "Those books do not belong in the trash. Put them down." Before Lexi could respond, a dark chuckle came from the doorway. Bradley leaned casually against the doorframe, holding a crystal tumbler filled with my expensive scotch. He had already shed his courtroom tie, looking entirely too comfortable in the home he had just legally stolen from me. "They belong wherever Lexi wants to put them," Vanessa Bradley said smoothly, taking a slow sip of his drink. The judge made it very clear. You signed away the house and everything inside it. If Lexi wants to use your boring old textbooks as kindling for the fireplace, she is completely within her legal rights. You are just a guest here now, a very temporary guest. He smiled that familiar, arrogant smile, the one that used to charm investors, but now just made my stomach turn. He was reveling in the power dynamic, desperate to watch me beg for my own possessions. I looked at the trash bag, then at Lexi's smug face, and finally at Bradley. I forced my hands to uncurl. I forced my breathing to remain steady. I knew any display of attachment would only fuel their sadistic pleasure. Fine, I said, keeping my voice entirely devoid of emotion. Make room for the ring lights. I turned my back on them, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a fight, and walked out of the library. Bradley laughed loudly behind me, mocking my apparent surrender. Let them have the books, I thought. They were going to need a lot of reading material where they were headed. I moved down the wide hallway toward the master suite to gather my clothes, but a sharp metallic clinking sound coming from the formal dining room caught my attention. I changed direction and pushed open the double doors. Beatrice was standing at the head of the long dining table. She had pulled out the heavy velvet-lined oak box from the antique sideboard. It was the box containing my grandmother's vintage silver cutlery. The set had been in my family for 4 generations, surviving wars, depressions, and cross-country migrations. It was the only item of true sentimental value I had brought into this marriage. Beatrice was humming a cheerful tune to herself as she polished a heavy silver soup spoon with a linen napkin before sliding it directly into her oversized designer handbag. "Put that back!" I commanded, my voice slicing through the quiet room like a whip. Beatrice paused, the silver spoon hovering just above the open zipper of her bag. She did not look guilty or startled. She looked deeply annoyed that I had interrupted her theft. She slowly placed the spoon into her bag and turned to face me, adjusting her diamond necklace with a look of supreme boredom. "I have no idea what you are talking about," she said, her tone dripping with false innocence. "I am simply taking inventory of the household assets. Bradley asked me to ensure nothing valuable goes missing before the new decorators arrive. That silver belonged to my grandmother," I said, taking a firm step toward her. "It is a family heirloom. It was not purchased with marital funds. It has nothing to do with Bradley or this house. Take it out of your bag right now." Beatrice closed the zipper of her handbag with a sharp, definitive zip. She picked up the bag and draped it over her forearm, clutching it tightly against her side. She looked me up and down, her eyes full of undisguised contempt, taking in my sensible blazer and practical shoes. "Your grandmother was a seamstress, Vanessa." Beatrice sneered, her upper lip curling in disgust. "This silver is entirely too fine for a family of common laborers. It belongs in a house like this, displayed for people who actually know how to host a proper society dinner. Besides, Schedule C was very clear. You signed away all household contents. The court gave this house and everything in it to my son. Therefore, it belongs to me now." I stared at her, absorbing the sheer magnitude of her greed. She did not even want the silver for its beauty or its history. She wanted it simply because it was mine, and taking it was another way to assert her absolute dominance. She wanted to strip away every last piece of my identity, right down to the spoons my grandmother used to feed me soup when I was a child. "You are a thief, Beatrice," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. "You are standing in a house I paid for, stealing heirlooms you have no right to touch." Beatrice did not flinch. Instead, she took a step closer to me, invading my personal space. The heavy scent of her floral perfume was suffocating. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and absolute triumph. "Oh, Vanessa, please stop embarrassing yourself," Beatrice said, shaking her head slowly. "You always had such a grossly inflated sense of your own importance. You really thought you built this life, did you not? You actually believed you were an equal partner in my son's success." She circled me slowly, like a predator examining a wounded animal. "You are just a glorified calculator, Vanessa. A forensic accountant. Please, you sit in a dark office and look at spreadsheets all day. You lack vision, you lack charm, you lack the pedigree required to navigate the upper echelons of Chicago society. Bradley is the visionary. He is the one with the brilliant mind, the charisma, the connections. He built that investment firm. He built this fortune. You were just riding his coattails the entire time, crunching numbers in the background like a dutiful little secretary. I stood perfectly still as she delivered her speech. My face remained an unreadable mask of stone. I let her words wash over me, absorbing every insult, every condescending remark. She thought she was crushing my spirit. She thought she was putting me in my place. But every word that fell from her arrogant lips only validated my entire strategy. A forensic accountant, a glorified calculator. Beatrice threw those words at me like they were mortal insults. She used my profession as a weapon to belittle my contribution to the marriage. But her arrogance was completely blinding her to the absolute danger she was currently standing in. She had entirely dismissed my skills, assuming that because I did not wear flashy designer brands or schmooze at country club galas, I was powerless. She failed to realize that a forensic accountant is highly trained to see exactly what people are desperately trying to hide. A glorified calculator knows exactly where every single penny comes from, where it goes, and who is legally responsible when it magically disappears. My forensic accounting skills were not a weakness. They were the exact weapon I had used to build the impenetrable trap that was currently closing around her son. I had spent the last 4 months digging through the digital bedrock of Bradley's fake empire. I had mapped out his embezzlement, tracked his offshore transfers, and calculated the massive federal penalties he was about to face. I had used my brilliant number-crunching mind to draft the liability clause in Schedule C, ensuring that when the federal agents came knocking, my hands would be completely clean and Bradley would be left holding the entire burning bag of evidence. But Beatrice knew none of this. She stood there clutching my grandmother's silver in her stolen designer bag, deeply convinced of her own supreme superiority. I looked at her, truly looked at her, seeing a woman whose entire existence was built on a fragile illusion of wealth, funded by stolen money. I felt a sudden, profound sense of calm wash over me. I did not need to fight her for the silver. Let her keep the spoons. Let her keep the heavy oak box. Let her carry it around proudly, completely unaware that the very assets she was so desperate to steal were securely chained to millions of dollars in federal tax fraud. You are right, Beatrice. I said, my voice perfectly smooth and compliant. Bradley is the visionary. He certainly had a unique way of managing the capital. I am sure his brilliant mind will handle the company's future liabilities perfectly. Beatrice smiled, a cold, victorious smirk spreading across her face. She thought she had finally forced me to admit defeat. She thought I had finally recognized my place at the bottom of her rigid social hierarchy. I am glad you have finally come to your senses, she said, adjusting her handbag securely on her shoulder. Now run along and pack your cheap clothes. The decorators are coming first thing tomorrow morning, and I want the stench of your mediocrity completely scrubbed from these walls. I gave her a single polite nod. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room, leaving her to gloat over her stolen silver. I walked back into the main foyer and picked up my empty suitcase. The wheels rolled silently over the imported Italian marble, a sharp contrast to the loud, destructive sounds echoing from the library. I climbed the grand, curved staircase, my hand trailing lightly over the polished mahogany banister I had personally chosen during the renovation. Every step felt lighter than the last. I reached the master suite and pushed the heavy door open. The massive walk-in closet was exactly as I left it, neatly organized by color and season. I only had 24 hours, but I did not need even a fraction of that time. I pulled out a few practical suits, some casual wear, and my toiletry bag. I did not touch the expensive jewelry Bradley had bought me, nor the designer dresses he demanded I wear to his corporate events. Those were props for a role I was no longer playing. I closed the suitcase and zipped it shut tightly, fully prepared to leave the sinking ship behind. I grabbed the handle of my small black suitcase and pulled it off the plush carpet of the master suite. The wheels rolled with a quiet efficiency as I moved back out into the expansive upstairs hallway. I did not look back at the room. I did not cast a final longing glance at the custom walk-in closet or the king-sized bed I had shared with a man who turned out to be a complete stranger. There was absolutely no room for nostalgia in my current strategy. I made my way to the top of the grand staircase. The sounds of destruction had ceased in the library, replaced by the grating, high-pitched sound of Lexi complaining about the Wi-Fi signal strength. I descended the curved marble stairs slowly, the suitcase bumping gently against my leg with each step. I kept my shoulders slumped and my chin tucked low, resuming the posture of a thoroughly broken woman. By the time I reached the main foyer, Bradley was waiting for me. He had finished his scotch and was now standing by the heavy mahogany front door, his arms crossed over his chest in a classic display of intimidation. Lexi stood safely behind him, holding her smartphone up as if she was preparing to record my humiliating exit for her thousands of non-existent followers. Beatrice hovered near the dining room entrance, still clutching her oversized designer bag tight against her side, clearly guarding her stolen silver. "You are leaving already?" Bradley asked, his voice dripping with faux disappointment. "I thought you would beg to stay at least through the night. It is pouring rain outside Vanessa. Where will you go?" I kept my gaze fixed on the marble floor near his expensive leather loafers. "I found a hotel," I said, keeping my voice soft and deliberately unsteady. "I just want to get this over with." Bradley chuckled, a harsh grating sound that echoed in the cavernous entryway. "Good," he said sharply, dropping the mock sympathy, "because you have exactly 24 hours to get the rest of your cheap garbage out of my house. If I find so much as a single pair of your sensible shoes in my closet by tomorrow evening, I am throwing them in the incinerator." I looked up at him, forcing my eyes to appear wide and fearful. "I only packed my clothes," I assured him weakly. "I left the jewelry and the designer bags upstairs. They are all yours." Bradley stepped closer to me, invading my personal space just as his mother had done earlier. He pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face. "You are absolutely right. They are mine." He snarled, his mask of corporate charm completely falling away to reveal the vicious bully underneath. "And do not think about sneaking back in here to steal anything of value. The judge gave me 100% of the assets. If you try to take so much as a decorative pillow or a single piece of artwork out of this house, I will call the police immediately and have you arrested for theft. You are a guest on my property, and your welcome has officially expired." Beatrice stepped forward from the dining room, her eyes darting suspiciously toward my small black suitcase. "Hold on a moment, Bradley," she interrupted, her voice sharp and commanding. "We cannot just trust her word. She is a desperate woman who just lost her meal ticket. Who knows what she managed to stuff into that bag when we were not looking? She might have grabbed the diamond earrings you bought her for your 5th anniversary." I gripped the handle of my suitcase tighter, feigning panic. Beatrice marched over to me and snatched the suitcase right out of my hand. She threw it unceremoniously onto the pristine marble floor and unzipped it with a violent jerk. Lexi stepped closer, holding her phone up higher, clearly hoping to capture me smuggling out expensive stolen goods. Beatrice rummaged through my neatly folded practical suits, my plain cotton shirts, and my basic toiletry bag. She tossed my sensible clothes aside carelessly, searching for hidden compartments. Finding absolutely nothing of value, she zipped the bag back up her face, registering mild disappointment. "Just a bunch of tragic office wear," Beatrice declared, loudly kicking the suitcase back toward my feet with the pointed toe of her designer heel. "Not a single thing worth pawning. I suppose we can let her leave with her rags." Bradley crossed his arms again, looking immensely satisfied. "You heard my mother," he commanded. "Take your rags and get off my property." I bent down slowly, picking up my suitcase with trembling hands. I looked at the three of them standing united against me. They formed a wall of absolute arrogance, entirely convinced of their own untouchable supremacy. Bradley with his stolen tech company, Beatrice with her stolen silver, and Lexi with her stolen life. I let a single pathetic sob escape my throat. "I am going," I whispered, keeping my head bowed in total submission. I dragged the suitcase toward the heavy mahogany door. Bradley stepped aside just enough to let me reach the brass handle, making sure to bump his shoulder aggressively against mine as I passed. I opened the door and stepped out into the freezing Chicago rain. The icy wind immediately whipped my hair across my face and soaked through my thin blazer. I did not put up my hood or open an umbrella. I needed them to see me suffering against the harsh elements. I took 2 steps onto the wet stone porch before the heavy mahogany door slammed violently shut behind me. The loud, definitive boom echoed across the quiet, manicured neighborhood. I heard the deadbolt slide into place with a heavy metallic clank. I was officially locked out of the estate. I stood shivering on the porch for exactly 10 seconds, ensuring they had enough time to walk away from the entryway window. Then I turned and began the long walk down the winding, tree-lined driveway. With every step I took away from that massive limestone house, the heavy, suffocating weight of my defeated persona began to completely melt away. My slumped shoulders straightened, pulling back with rigid, undeniable, perfect posture. My shallow, panicked breathing deepened into slow, controlled, powerful intakes of the crisp, freezing air. The pathetic, fearful trembling in my hands vanished instantly, replaced by a steady, rock-solid grip on my suitcase handle. The cold rain soaked my clothes, but I barely registered the temperature. The fire of pure, calculated anticipation burning in my chest kept me entirely warm. I reached the towering wrought iron security gates at the end of the property. I did not look back at the mansion. I had zero attachment to the bricks and mortar they were so desperately fighting to keep. They could have the superficial shell of success. I was walking away with the absolute certainty of their impending destruction. The defeated, broken wife they thought they had just thrown onto the street ceased to exist the moment the gates closed behind me. Just beyond the main property line, parked very discreetly under the heavy shadow of a massive oak tree, sat a sleek, dark-tinted black Maybach. The heavy rain beaded and ran smoothly off its polished exterior. As I approached the luxury vehicle, the rear passenger door swung open silently. The plush climate-controlled interior offered immediate sanctuary from the freezing Chicago storm. I handed my wet suitcase to the imposing driver waiting quietly outside and climbed into the expansive back seat. The heavy door shut firmly behind me, instantly cutting off the howling wind and pounding rain. The contrast was staggering. The interior smelled of expensive leather and quiet money. Sitting across from me in the spacious cabin was my mother Miriam, looking impeccably sharp in her tailored charcoal suit. Beside her sat my attorney Harrison, his briefcase open on his lap, a small, knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Miriam reached over to the built-in silver cooler console between the seats. She pulled out a chilled crystal flute and poured a generous measure of vintage champagne, the bubbles fizzing sharply in the quiet, insulated space. She handed the delicate glass to me. Her dark eyes, usually so guarded and stern, sparkled with an intense, fierce pride. She leaned forward, the leather seat creaking softly under her movement. "Did they sign?" Miriam asked, her voice steady and thrumming with quiet power. I took the cold crystal glass from her hand. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne, letting the crisp, dry taste wash away the bitter memory of Beatrice and Bradley. I leaned back into the plush leather seat, crossing my legs with absolute composure. A slow, chilling smirk spread across my face, marking the very first real display of my true power. They signed for everything, I answered. The memory of how this entire war began always brings me back to a single freezing night, exactly 4 months ago. It was Thanksgiving. The dining room of our Gold Coast estate was bathed in the warm, golden glow of the crystal chandelier. The table was set with the very same vintage silver cutlery Beatrice had just tried to steal. The air smelled of roasted sage, expensive wine, and the suffocating scent of Beatrice's floral perfume. Bradley sat at the head of the long mahogany table, holding a crystal glass, soaking up the absolute adoration of his assembled family. He was wearing a cashmere sweater, looking the part of the benevolent, wildly successful patriarch. He tapped his knife against his glass to call for a toast. He puffed out his chest and announced that his tech investment firm had just crushed the third quarter, reporting record-breaking profits and securing a massive new round of venture capital. Beatrice immediately raised her glass, beaming at her son with a sickening level of pride. She toasted to his singular genius, praising his brilliant mind and his unparalleled business instincts. She made sure to look directly at me across the table, offering a tight, patronizing smile. She loudly proclaimed how lucky I was that Bradley worked so hard to provide me with such a beautiful home. She did not mention that I had cooked the entire meal. She certainly did not mention that I was the one who personally audited the third quarter financials and structured the tax shielding that made those profits look so spectacular on paper. I simply smiled, clinked my glass, and let Bradley play the hero. I loved him, or at least I thought I loved the man he pretended to be. I was content to be the quiet architect of our wealth while he stood in the spotlight. But the illusion shattered completely just a few hours later. By 1 in the morning, the house was entirely silent. The guests had gone home. Bradley was passed out in the master suite, snoring softly after consuming the better part of a bottle of scotch. I was sitting in my home office on the ground floor, wrapped in a thick cardigan. The only light in the room came from the bright glare of my dual monitors. I was running the year-end tax projections for the firm. As a forensic accountant, I have a specific relationship with numbers. They speak to me in patterns. When a pattern breaks, it feels like a physical jolt to my system. I was reconciling the domestic clearing accounts against our primary holding fund when I noticed a glaring discrepancy. It was not a rounding error. It was not a misplaced decimal. It was a massive gaping hole in the capital reserves. Exactly $4 million was missing. My initial reaction was pure adrenaline-fueled panic. I assumed we had been hacked. I assumed a catastrophic banking error had occurred. My hands flew across the keyboard as I immediately began pulling the raw transaction logs from the banking portal. I bypassed the summary dashboards Bradley usually reviewed and dug straight into the raw data feeds. I pulled up the wire transfer history for the past 9 months, sorting the data by volume and frequency. The panic slowly morphed into a cold, creeping dread. We had not been hacked by an outside entity. The calls were coming from inside the house. I found a series of recurring 6-figure wire transfers categorized under vague labels like strategic marketing consultation, asset acquisition, and executive travel logistics. They were perfectly spaced out, designed to look like routine operational expenses to a casual observer. But I was not a casual observer. I built the firm's financial architecture, and I knew for an absolute fact that we did not have marketing retainers that large. I isolated the routing numbers for the receiving accounts. They all funneled into a single obscure limited liability company registered in Delaware. I logged into a federal corporate registry database, a tool I use daily for client due diligence, and pulled the ownership records for that specific entity. The registered agent was a shell service, but the primary beneficiary was Bradley. He had set up a shadow company. I sat back in my desk chair, the glow of the monitors reflecting off my face. My husband was siphoning client funds. He was pulling massive amounts of capital out of the investment firm, moving it through a dummy corporation, and hiding it from the official ledgers. But the question was why? Bradley made an exceptional, legitimate income. We wanted for nothing. Why would he risk federal prison to steal $4 million? I needed to see where the money was going after it hit the shadow company. Using my administrative credentials, I traced the outbound transactions from the Delaware entity. What I found over the next 3 hours completely dismantled my reality. The first massive expense was a recurring wire transfer to an upscale property management firm in downtown Chicago. I cross-referenced the property address. It was a luxury penthouse apartment overlooking Millennium Park. The lease was not in Bradley's name. It was in the name of a 23-year-old woman named Lexi. I opened a new browser tab and searched her name. Her public social media profiles immediately populated my screen. She listed her profession as a luxury lifestyle influencer. My eyes scanned her recent posts. There she was posing on the balcony of the downtown penthouse sipping champagne. There she was showing off a brand new diamond tennis bracelet. There she was sitting in the passenger seat of Bradley's sports car, the edge of his distinctive luxury watch visible on the steering wheel in the frame. The betrayal hit me with the force of a freight train. He was not just having an affair. He was funding an entire secondary life for a woman 12 years his junior. But the digital paper trail did not stop with Lexi. As I dug deeper into the outbound wires from the shadow company, I found another horrifying pattern of expenditures. I saw massive, unexplainable payments to a prestigious country club in the northern suburbs. I saw payments to a luxury European car dealership. I saw wire transfers covering highly publicized charity gala tables, the kind that cost $50,000 a seat. I knew exactly who held that country club membership. I knew exactly who drove a brand new Mercedes from that specific dealership. I knew exactly who sat at those charity gala tables just last month. Beatrice. My mother-in-law was not independently wealthy. The old money fortune she constantly bragged about had apparently dried up years ago. Bradley was secretly funding her lavish, elitist lifestyle using the exact same stolen client funds he used to pay for his mistress. Beatrice's designer bags, her extensive European vacations, her entire persona of untouchable superiority was a complete and total fraud. It was all being paid for by stolen money. I sat in the quiet darkness of my office, the silence of the house pressing down on me. I felt as if the floor had suddenly dropped out from under my feet. Everything I knew was a lie. The man sleeping upstairs was not a brilliant tech visionary. He was a common thief and embezzler running a high-stakes Ponzi scheme with his clients' investments. He was bleeding the company dry to play the role of a billionaire sugar daddy and to keep his mother draped in diamonds. The full, terrifying scope of the situation materialized in my mind. Because I was the named financial officer on several of the legitimate company accounts, Bradley's crimes could easily be pinned on me if the federal authorities ever looked into the missing funds. If the regulatory agencies audited the firm tomorrow, Bradley could simply point the finger at his forensic accountant wife. He had positioned me perfectly to be his scapegoat. A normal person might have screamed. A normal wife might have run upstairs, shaken her husband awake, and demanded an explanation. She might have thrown his clothes out the window, cried to her mother-in-law, or filed for an immediate loud divorce. I did none of those things. I did not shed a single tear. The betrayal bypassed my heart and went straight to the cold, calculating center of my brain. If Bradley wanted to play a high-stakes game with numbers, he had severely underestimated his opponent. I reached for my coffee mug. The coffee was ice cold, but I drank it anyway, welcoming the bitter taste. I turned back to my dual monitors. I began downloading every single ledger, every wire transfer receipt, every offshore account routing number, and every corporate registration document. I compiled the evidence meticulously, building an airtight, undeniable digital vault of Bradley's crimes. I encrypted the files, uploaded them to a secure, untraceable cloud server, and wiped my search history completely clean. I spent the rest of the night mapping out the exact legal and financial architecture required to untangle my name from his burning ship. I knew I could not confront him yet. I needed time. I needed to insulate myself, protect my own assets, and build a trap so devastating, so perfectly disguised, that his massive ego would force him to walk right into it. When the sun finally began to rise over Lake Michigan, casting a pale gray light into my home office, my plan was fully formed. I closed my laptop, stood up, and stretched my stiff muscles. I walked upstairs to the master suite. Bradley was still asleep, his chest rising and falling rhythmically under the heavy duvet. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely nothing. He thought he was the smartest man in Chicago. He thought he could use my brilliant mind to build his fortune, and then discard me while spending the profits on his mistress and his mother. He had no idea that the quiet, dutiful wife he took for granted had just finished drafting his absolute destruction. I carefully washed my face, letting the hot water soothe the tension in my jaw. I rehearsed my morning greeting, ensuring my voice carried the usual warmth and respect Bradley expected. When I walked back into the bedroom, he was stirring. He rubbed his eyes, groaning about a headache from the expensive wine. I handed him a glass of water and an aspirin, playing the role of the attentive, supportive wife to absolute perfection. He took the pills without a word of thanks, immediately reaching for his phone to check his messages. Probably texting Lexi, I thought, pouring myself a fresh cup of coffee. "Good morning, darling," I said smoothly. "Did you sleep well?" He grunted an affirmative response, already lost in his digital world of lies. I smiled, sipping my coffee. The trap was set. The countdown had officially started. All I had to do now was wait for the perfect moment to let the entire house of cards collapse. I spent the next 4 weeks playing the most dangerous, suffocating game of my entire life. I smiled warmly at Bradley over our morning coffee, pouring his dark roast exactly how he liked it. I attended his lavish corporate holiday parties, wearing the expensive, understated dresses he preferred, playing the role of the dutiful, quiet wife. I nodded sympathetically as he complained about how exhausting his long days at the office were, knowing full well he was spending his afternoons in a downtown penthouse with a 23-year-old influencer. All the while, behind the locked door of my home office, I was meticulously building the digital cage that would eventually hold him. But there was one variable in this equation I had not fully accounted for, and that was his mother. Part of me, the naive, empathetic part that still believed in some fundamental code of human decency and family loyalty, thought Beatrice was simply a victim of her son's elaborate deception. I assumed Bradley was lying to her just as effortlessly as he was lying to me. I thought that if she knew he was risking a decade in a federal penitentiary to pay for her exclusive country club memberships, her maternal instinct would immediately override her greed. I decided I owed her a chance. I owed her the truth. It was exactly 1 month after that horrifying Thanksgiving revelation. Late December winds were howling off Lake Michigan, turning the city into a frozen fortress. I arranged to meet Beatrice for a private afternoon tea at the very country club Bradley was illegally funding with stolen client capital. The opulent dining room was practically empty, featuring massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a pristine snow-covered golf course. Beatrice sat across from me, stirring a heavy silver spoon in her delicate porcelain teacup. She looked every inch the untouchable generational matriarch in her tailored Chanel suit and perfectly styled hair. She was loudly complaining to the waiter about the slow service and the temperature of her scones, completely oblivious to the financial guillotine swinging directly above her son's neck. I waited until the waiter retreated before I took a deep, steadying breath. I reached into my structured leather tote bag and pulled out a single, heavily redacted spreadsheet. I placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth, sliding it squarely into the space between us. Beatrice glanced down at the paper, her perfectly arched eyebrows drawing together in immediate visible annoyance. "What on earth is this, Vanessa?" she asked, her tone dripping with intense exhaustion, as if I had just handed her a soiled napkin. "We are at lunch. I do not want to look at your dreary little accounting spreadsheets. Put that away before someone sees it and thinks we are discussing taxes." I kept my hand flat on the paper, leaning forward so my voice would not carry across the quiet, cavernous dining room. "Beatrice, you need to look at this," I said, keeping my tone urgently hushed and completely serious. "This is not a routine accounting report. Bradley is in terrible danger. I found massive discrepancies in the firm's primary holding accounts. Over $4 million has been actively diverted into a shadow corporation registered in Delaware. He is embezzling client funds, Beatrice. He is committing massive federal fraud on a scale that will ruin everything." I watched her face closely, waiting for the shock, the denial, or the sudden maternal panic. I expected her to gasp, to call me a liar, to demand I show her the proof so she could confront him herself. Instead, Beatrice slowly picked up her teacup, took a very delicate sip of her Earl Grey, and set it down with a soft clink against the matching saucer. She did not even blink. She did not look down at the spreadsheet. She looked directly into my eyes, and the sheer glacial emptiness in her gaze made the blood freeze completely in my veins. "You are being hysterical, Vanessa," she said, her voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous whisper. "You have been working entirely too hard in that dark little office of yours. The numbers are making you paranoid." I pushed the paper an inch closer to her. "I am not paranoid. I insisted, tapping my index finger against the highlighted routing numbers. I tracked the outbound wire transfers personally. The money is paying for Lexi's luxury penthouse apartment downtown. It is paying for your exorbitant country club dues. It is paying for the brand new Mercedes currently sitting in your driveway. If the Securities and Exchange Commission runs even a routine audit, Bradley will go to federal prison for decades. They will seize absolutely everything. I'm trying to give you the chance to stop him before it is completely too late. Beatrice finally reached out and picked up the piece of paper. She did not read a single line of the financial data. She folded it precisely in half, then in half again, and tucked it smoothly under her salad plate, as if it were a piece of trash. She leaned back in her upholstered chair, crossing her arms over her chest, examining me as if I were a particularly repulsive insect that had just crawled onto her pristine table. "You really do not understand how true wealth operates, do you?" she said, her voice dripping with pure, unadulterated condescension. "You come from such a small, limited working-class background. You think strictly in terms of simple addition and subtraction. You think like a clerk. Bradley does not think like a clerk. Bradley operates on a plane you cannot possibly comprehend." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by her bizarre reaction. "Beatrice, this is not high-level financial strategy," I argued, my voice trembling slightly with disbelief. "This is outright theft. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme. He is stealing money from wealthy investors who will absolutely destroy him when they find out. He is funding a mistress with stolen money." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking sigh, rolling her eyes dramatically toward the vaulted ceiling. "Oh, please, Vanessa. Grow up," she sneered. "Men of Bradley's stature and brilliance have certain appetites. They have certain needs. Lexi is just a minor distraction, a shiny new toy for him to play with. He always comes home to you, does he not? He keeps you perfectly comfortable in that beautiful Gold Coast house. He lets you play at being a corporate executive. You should be down on your knees thanking him every single day for the life he has generously provided for you, instead of digging through his private accounts, looking for reasons to complain like a jealous, bitter shrew." The sheer audacity of her statement left me momentarily breathless. She was not just dismissing the massive financial crimes, she was actively justifying his infidelity. She was telling me straight to my face that my absolute silence and my blind compliance were the price I had to pay for the privilege of being married to her son. She knew about Lexi. She knew about everything. "You knew," I whispered, the horrifying realization washing over me like a bucket of ice water. "You have known this entire time. You know he is stealing millions from his clients. You know he is cheating on his wife. And you are perfectly fine with it as long as the checks keep clearing and your status is maintained." Beatrice's eyes narrowed into dark, vicious slits. She leaned sharply across the table, her face coming within inches of mine, the smell of her floral perfume suddenly suffocating. "You listen to me very carefully, you ungrateful little nobody," she hissed, dropping all pretense of country club civility. "My son is a genius. If he moved money, it is because he knows how to make it grow. Keep your mouth shut, or I will make sure you never work in Chicago again." I did not back down. I held my ground, planting my hands firmly on the edge of the table and glaring right back into her furious, arrogant eyes. "He is a criminal, Beatrice," I stated clearly and firmly, refusing to let her intimidate me. "And when the federal agents come for him, they are going to come for you too, because you are actively spending the stolen money." The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. Beatrice's right hand shot across the table faster than I could blink. The sharp, resounding crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed like a gunshot through the quiet dining room. My head snapped violently to the side from the sheer force of the sudden blow. A sharp, stinging pain radiated across my skin. A few patrons at the far end of the room turned their heads in alarm, but Beatrice immediately sat back down, smoothing the lapels of her jacket and picking up her teacup as if absolutely nothing had happened. My cheek burned like fire. I slowly turned my head back to face her. I did not reach up to touch my stinging face. I did not let a single tear form in my eyes. In that precise stinging moment, the final veil dropped completely to the floor. The betrayal was absolute, total, and unforgivable. I had walked into this country club hoping to save a mother from the unimaginable pain of losing her only son to a federal penitentiary. Instead, I had uncovered a nest of vipers. Beatrice was not a naive, innocent bystander living in blissful ignorance of her son's dark deeds. She was a fully aware, highly complicit co-conspirator. She was actively participating in the fraud, eagerly spending the stolen funds to maintain her hollow social status, and completely willing to resort to physical violence and career-ending threats to protect their golden goose. As I looked at the woman sitting across from me sipping her expensive tea with supreme unwarranted arrogance, a profound, terrifying clarity settled over my mind. They were all in on it. The entire family operated on a foundation of toxic entitlement, firmly believing they were completely above the law and entirely beyond any consequences. I slowly stood up from the table, my posture rigid and proud. I did not say another word to her. I did not need to. I turned on my heel and walked out of the opulent dining room, leaving the folded spreadsheet tucked neatly under her salad plate. My cheek still stung fiercely, but the physical pain was entirely eclipsed by the cold mechanical precision clicking into place inside my head. The time for warnings and empathy was officially over. They had demanded a war, and I was going to give them a massacre. I spent the next 3 months operating with the cold mechanical precision of a bomb disposal expert. Every morning I woke up, poured Bradley his dark roast coffee, and kissed him on the cheek as he left for his supposed executive meetings. The moment his luxury car pulled out of the driveway, I locked myself in my home office and went to work systematically dismantling our shared life. I could not afford to make a single mistake. I could not let him see even a flicker of suspicion in my eyes. I had to become a ghost within my own marriage, entirely present, but fundamentally absent. My first priority was severing my legal liability from the tech investment firm. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly how deep the federal agencies would dig once the embezzlement was exposed. I needed to ensure my name was completely removed from the blast radius. Bradley had always been arrogant about the administrative side of the business, viewing paperwork as beneath him. He frequently signed stacks of documents without reading them, relying entirely on my expertise to manage the corporate structure. I used this arrogance against him. Over the course of 6 weeks, I drafted a series of complex corporate restructuring documents. I buried my resignation as the firm's primary financial officer deep within a massive portfolio of routine quarterly tax filings. I included clauses that formally transferred all my fiduciary responsibilities and voting rights to Bradley. I handed him the thick stack of papers right before a major client dinner, casually mentioning it was just standard year-end compliance nonsense. He signed every single page without glancing at the text. He was too busy adjusting his tie and checking his reflection in the hallway mirror. With my corporate liability officially severed, I turned my attention to the federal authorities. I could not just walk away and let Bradley continue stealing millions from his investors to fund his mistress and his mother. I had a moral obligation, and more importantly, I needed the absolute protection of federal immunity. I compiled the massive cache of evidence I had downloaded on Thanksgiving night. I organized the offshore routing numbers, the Delaware Shell Company registrations, and the detailed ledgers of stolen client funds. I drafted a comprehensive, irrefutable whistleblower report. I used an encrypted, untraceable server to submit the entire dossier directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. I did not ask for a reward. I asked only for complete anonymity and total immunity from prosecution. Given the sheer volume and quality of the evidence I provided, the federal agencies granted my requests immediately. The trap was now officially baited, and the federal government was holding the net. My final task was securing my own financial future. The joint accounts I shared with Bradley were tainted by the commingled stolen funds. I knew the moment the federal raid occurred, those accounts would be frozen and seized. I needed to protect my legitimate personal savings, the money I had earned through my own private consulting contracts over the last 10 years. I contacted a highly specialized international tax attorney based in Geneva. Working through secure channels, we established a deeply insulated offshore trust in the Cayman Islands. It was a completely legal, incredibly complex financial structure designed specifically to protect assets from domestic civil litigation. Over the next 2 months, I slowly, methodically transferred my personal capital into the trust. I moved the money in small, irregular increments, disguising the outbound wires as routine market investments. By the time I was finished, my financial independence was absolutely secure, and my assets were completely untouchable. I had effectively insulated myself from the impending disaster. I had built the trap, secured my escape route, and handed the detonator to the federal government. But I still needed Bradley to take the final fatal step. I needed him to formally assume total retroactive liability for the company's actions. I needed him to demand the divorce. I started dropping subtle, calculated hints about his infidelity. I left restaurant receipts with suspicious charges on the kitchen counter. I mentioned casually that I had driven past the luxury apartment building where Lexi lived. I asked pointed questions about his late-night meetings. I did not accuse him directly. I just let him know that I was starting to notice the cracks in his facade. The pressure worked perfectly. Bradley panicked. He assumed I was getting close to discovering his affair, and his massive ego demanded that he strike first. He filed for divorce 2 weeks later, blindsiding me with aggressive legal representation and outrageous demands. He wanted to strip me of everything before I could uncover his secrets. He thought he was outsmarting me. He thought he was securing his fortune and his freedom. He had absolutely no idea he was sprinting directly into the precise center of my trap. Which brings me back to the present moment, sitting in the luxurious, quiet interior of the black Maybach, the rain still pounding against the tinted windows. The defeated, broken wife I had played in the courtroom was gone. The cold, calculating forensic accountant was firmly back in control. Harrison, sitting across from me, reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a sleek silver iPad and tapped the screen a few times, unlocking a secure application. He did not say a word as he handed the device across the small space between us. His eyes were bright with a quiet, fierce satisfaction. I took the iPad, the cool metal smooth against my fingertips. The screen displayed a highly classified real-time alert from the federal database I had been monitoring through my legal channels. The alert was flagged with a bright red banner. It was a formal notification of impending enforcement action. The text was brief, clinical, and absolutely devastating. The Securities and Exchange Commission, acting in conjunction with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division, had officially concluded their preliminary investigation into Bradley's tech investment firm. The evidence I had provided as an anonymous whistleblower had been thoroughly verified. The federal agencies had secured the necessary warrants. The raid on the corporate headquarters and Bradley's personal properties was scheduled for this coming Friday. I looked down at the digital clock on the iPad screen. It was currently Tuesday afternoon. Bradley had exactly 3 days left to enjoy his stolen empire. He had exactly 3 days to gloat in the Gold Coast estate, to drink my expensive wine, and to celebrate his supposed victory with Lexi and Beatrice. In 72 hours, the federal government was going to kick down his front door, freeze every single account tied to his name, and place him under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud and tax evasion. I handed the iPad back to Harrison. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, closing my eyes for a brief moment, letting the profound, absolute reality of my victory wash over me. The trap was set. The contract was signed. The federal agents were already mobilizing. There was nothing left to do but watch the entire house of cards collapse. My phone buzzed against the polished mahogany desk in Harrison's downtown office. I picked it up, unlocking the screen to find another message from Bradley. It was a photo of him sitting in my custom leather reading chair in the library. He was holding a bottle of Chateau Margaux from my private reserve, the very bottle I had been saving to celebrate my 35th birthday. He was smiling directly into the camera, a look of pure, unadulterated triumph on his face. The caption below the photo read, "Cheers to the winner. Tastes better when it's free." I did not delete the message. I did not respond. I simply took a screenshot and saved it to a dedicated file on my secure cloud drive. I was documenting every single piece of his hubris. Across the massive Gold Coast estate, Bradley and Lexi were living exactly the way I knew they would. They were treating the house like a conquered territory, completely oblivious to the fact that they were dancing on top of a live landmine. Lexi had immediately begun documenting their hostile takeover for her social media following. Just that morning, a friend had forwarded me a link to her latest video. Lexi was standing in the grand foyer, holding a massive iced coffee, giving a highly edited tour of my home. "Welcome to the new and improved mansion, guys," Lexi said to the camera, flipping her hair over her shoulder. "We are completely gutting this place." The boring ex-wife had zero vision. We are talking sterile grays, depressing vintage furniture, and zero natural light. It was giving major spinster vibes. Bradley and I are bringing in a top-tier design team to modernize everything. Think stark white marble neon accents and a dedicated content creation studio. She spun the camera around to show the formal dining room, the exact spot where Beatrice had tried to steal my grandmother's silver just a few days prior. "We are throwing a massive party this Friday to celebrate the divorce and our official engagement. It is going to be iconic." I closed the video, tossing my phone back onto the desk. Harrison sat across from me, reviewing a stack of heavily redacted federal documents. The high-rise office offered a sweeping panoramic view of the Chicago skyline, the gray clouds finally breaking to reveal patches of brilliant blue sky. It was a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere of the courtroom where this entire operation had begun. Harrison looked up, noticing my slight frown. "He is still texting you?" Harrison asked, his voice calm and steady. "He sent a picture drinking my Margot," I replied, picking up my coffee cup. "He thinks he is untouchable. He thinks he completely outsmarted me in that courtroom." Harrison let out a low, humorless chuckle. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He has absolutely no idea what he actually signed. His legal team was so focused on securing the visible assets that they completely failed to analyze the underlying structure. They were blinded by the sheer volume of the wealth being transferred. "Let's break it down again," I said, needing to hear the precise mechanics of the trap spoken aloud. It grounded me, reinforcing the reality of what we had achieved. Harrison nodded, leaning forward and tapping a specific page in the thick legal binder resting between us. Schedule C, the attachment. To the untrained eye or to a lazy lawyer rushing to secure a massive bonus, it looks like a standard addendum listing the transfer of corporate assets and real estate holdings. It lists the Gold Coast property, the tech investment firm, the bank accounts, and the domestic holding companies. He turned the page, highlighting a dense, incredibly complex paragraph buried deep within the legal jargon. But right here, Harrison continued, his finger tracing the lines of text. "This is the masterpiece you drafted." Section 4, Paragraph B. The assumption of total liability clause. By demanding 100% equity and absolute control of the tech investment firm, Bradley legally agreed to sever your fiduciary responsibility retroactively. He demanded that you indemnify him, meaning you cannot be held responsible for any corporate actions taken prior to the date of the divorce decree. I smiled a genuine cold smile, and in doing so, he legally assumed sole retroactive responsibility for all corporate debts, all financial discrepancies, and all federal penalties associated with that specific entity. "Exactly," Harrison confirmed. "By forcing you to sign away your 50% stake to gain total control, he willingly placed the entire burden of the embezzlement directly onto his own shoulders." When the Securities and Exchange Commission and the IRS traced the missing $4 million back to the Delaware Shell Company, the only name legally tethered to that entity is Bradley's. You are completely insulated. Your hands are legally clean. He cannot point the finger at his forensic accountant wife because he forced you to sign a document stating he was the sole financial authority. It was the perfect execution of corporate jujitsu. I had used his massive ego and his desperate need for total dominance against him. He wanted to claim that I was just a glorified calculator, a secondary player in his brilliant empire. I had simply codified his arrogant belief into binding federal law. But the trap did not stop with the investment firm. The corporate fraud was only half of the equation. The other half involved the magnificent limestone mansion he was currently defiling with his mistress, and the house I prompted wanting to review the second layer of the destruction. Harrison flipped to another section of the binder. This is where your mother-in-law's arrogance seals her own fate. The Gold Coast estate was not owned outright. Bradley had secretly taken out a massive predatory commercial loan against the property to fund his embezzlement cover-ups and maintain cash flow for his fake billionaire lifestyle. I nodded, remembering the terrifying moment I discovered the secondary loan documents hidden in a secure server. He had leveraged our home to hide his theft. The attachment legally bound the deed of the house exclusively to that toxic commercial loan, Harrison explained, tracing the legal pathway. When the federal agents freeze Bradley's assets on Friday, that commercial loan will immediately default. The bank will initiate swift foreclosure proceedings. And Beatrice, I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper. Harrison smiled, a sharp, predatory look crossing his features. Beatrice co-signed that commercial loan. She put her own name on the dotted line to help her golden boy secure the capital. When the loan defaults due to the federal asset freeze, the bank will not just take the house. They will immediately go after the co-signer to recoup their losses. Her personal accounts, her remaining trust funds, her country club memberships. Everything she owns will be seized to satisfy the debt. I leaned back in my chair, absorbing the absolute devastating beauty of the legal architecture. Beatrice had stood in that courtroom laughing as I signed away my life. She had stood in my dining room, stealing my grandmother's silver, mocking my working-class background. She believed she was securing a multi-million-dollar estate for her son and his new, easily manipulated bride. She had absolutely no idea that she had proudly co-signed her own complete financial ruin. The massive oak doors of the Gold Coast estate swung open, revealing the cavernous, opulent foyer. Beatrice stood in the center of the marble floor, her expensive heels clicking sharply as she surveyed the space with a critical, imperious eye. She held a thick clipboard filled with swatches of imported silk and heavily embossed wallpaper samples, her personal decorator hovering anxiously behind her, like a nervous shadow. Lexi was currently upstairs, loudly complaining about the insufficient water pressure in the master bathroom shower, her nasal voice echoing down the sweeping, curved staircase. Bradley was expected home shortly, supposedly closing another massive deal that would fund their extravagant weekend plans. The house, which had once felt like a sanctuary I meticulously built, now resonated with the hollow, aggressive energy of an ongoing hostile occupation. Beatrice tapped her manicured finger against her clipboard, scowling at the sophisticated control panel mounted discreetly on the wall near the main entrance. The panel controlled the entire integrated smart home system, everything from the ambient lighting and the multi-zone climate control to the high-end security cameras and the automated window shades. It was a complex, highly secure system I had personally installed and programmed, ensuring the house ran with quiet, flawless efficiency. Beatrice poked aggressively at the sleek glass screen, but the interface remained stubbornly locked, displaying a stark, bright red error message demanding a master administrative password. She let out a sharp, frustrated sigh, turning to glare at her trembling decorator. This entire house is completely dysfunctional. Beatrice snapped, her voice tight with irritation. How am I supposed to properly evaluate the natural lighting in the formal dining room if I cannot even raise these ridiculous motorized shades? She jabbed the screen one more time, the red error message flashing mockingly back at her. It is absolutely unacceptable that I have to deal with these technical hurdles. That woman could not do anything right. Upstairs, Lexi's complaining grew louder. Beatrice, Lexi shouted from the landing, leaning over the polished mahogany railing. The water in this shower is freezing cold, and the heated floors in the bathroom are totally turned off. I cannot do my skincare routine in these conditions. I need to film a brand sponsorship video in an hour. Beatrice pinched the bridge of her nose, clearly exasperated by the sheer incompetence surrounding her. She pulled her sleek smartphone from her designer bag, scrolling aggressively through her contacts until she found my number. She hesitated for only a fraction of a second, her immense pride briefly warring with her immediate need for total control. Pride lost. She tapped the screen to initiate the call, her posture rigid and demanding. I was sitting in Harrison's bright, modern high-rise office, watching the rain continue to wash over the sprawling Chicago skyline. The federal alert still glowed softly on the iPad resting between us, a silent countdown to absolute destruction. When my phone buzzed against the polished desk, the caller ID flashing Beatrice's name, I did not feel a single spike of anxiety. I felt a profound, chilling sense of calm. Harrison gave me a subtle nod, his eyes sharp and observant. I answered the call, keeping my voice perfectly level and entirely compliant. "Hello, Beatrice," I said, ensuring my tone betrayed absolutely nothing. "Vanessa." Beatrice barked immediately, entirely skipping any pretense of a polite greeting. "I am at the house with the new interior design team. Lexi is trying to adjust the ambient lighting in the main foyer for a promotional video, and the temperature in the entire East Wing is dropping rapidly. The smart home system is completely locked down. I need the master administrative passwords immediately." I listened to the chaotic sounds filtering through the phone. I could hear the decorators frantically discussing paint samples, and Lexi's muffled whining echoing from the upper floors. They were actively, eagerly dismantling my home, entirely focused on superficial aesthetics, while a massive federal guillotine hung directly over their heads. They were arguing about shower temperatures while standing on a financial fault line that was about to rupture completely. "Of course, Beatrice," I said smoothly, pulling a sleek silver pen from the holder on Harrison's desk. "I can absolutely give you the master access codes. It is a dual authentication process. Are you standing near the main control panel in the foyer?" "Yes, I am right here," Beatrice snapped impatiently, the sound of her tapping her nails against the glass screen clearly audible. "Just tell me what to type. I do not have time for a complicated technical tutorial. We have a massive divorce party to plan for Friday night, and I need this house functioning perfectly." I read off the complex 16-character alphanumeric sequence, very slowly, ensuring she entered every single letter and number correctly. I listened as the system chimed softly in the background, signaling that the master override had been successfully accepted. I did not argue with her demands. I did not express any sadness or anger about them utterly destroying the home I had painstakingly built. I simply provided the keys to a kingdom that was already scheduled to burn straight to the ground. "There," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with satisfaction as the ambient lighting in the foyer suddenly flared to life. "The system is finally unlocked. I must say it is quite refreshing to deal with you now that you finally understand your proper place. You are being remarkably cooperative. I suppose you realize fighting us is completely pointless." I smiled, staring out at the towering skyscrapers stretching toward the dark clouds. "I am simply following the strict terms of the legal settlement, Beatrice." I replied, my voice cool and even. "The judge gave Bradley total control of the estate. It is his house now. He is solely responsible for everything attached to it." Beatrice let out a short, dismissive laugh, clearly reveling in her perceived absolute victory. "Yes, he certainly is. He earned every bit of it through his brilliant vision. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a catering menu to finalize for Friday. We are expecting over 200 prominent guests, and I want everything to be absolutely flawless. Try not to call this number again. I will not need to." I promised quietly, the finality of the statement hanging heavy in the air. "Enjoy the house, Beatrice. You earned it." I ended the call before she could respond, setting the phone face down on the smooth desk. I looked over at Harrison, who was already compiling the final tranche of offshore transfer documents I needed to sign. He raised an eyebrow, a silent question hovering in the quiet office. Friday night, I confirmed, picking up my coffee cup. They are throwing a massive catered celebration of their own hubris on the exact same night the federal raid is scheduled to execute. They invited the entire Chicago elite to watch their empire collapse in real time. Harrison let out a low, appreciative whistle, shaking his head in sheer disbelief at their staggering arrogance. The poetic justice is almost too perfect to believe. They are literally hosting their own execution. I turned back to the window, watching the rain-slicked streets below. The trap was fully set, The bait was taken and the predators were currently celebrating their successful hunt, completely unaware that they were actually the prey. The assumption of total liability clause was locked securely in the federal archives. The toxic commercial loan was quietly ticking like a time bomb tethered directly to Beatrice's personal bank accounts. Bradley believed he was a brilliant tech visionary who had successfully outmaneuvered his boring numbers-obsessed wife. He believed he had secured a massive fortune to fund his glamorous new life with Lexi. He had no idea that the moment he forced me to sign away my 50% equity, he had legally strapped himself to a sinking ship loaded with $4 million of embezzled client funds. He had willingly, eagerly signed a document that explicitly indemnified me from all corporate actions prior to the divorce decree. He had literally begged the judge to make him solely responsible for the massive federal fraud he had committed. And Beatrice was perhaps the most tragic, arrogant player in this entire deadly game. She believed she was a master manipulator, a high society matriarch who had successfully protected her son's stolen wealth. She had sneered at my grandmother's silver, mocked my career, and slapped me across the face to protect her country club lifestyle. She thought co-signing that massive predatory commercial loan was just a minor administrative hurdle to help her genius son secure temporary liquidity. She never bothered to read the fine print. She never considered the catastrophic consequences of tying her entire personal net worth to a loan secured against a fraudulently acquired asset. When the SEC and the IRS froze Bradley's accounts on Friday, that commercial loan would immediately default. The bank would not hesitate. They would instantly seize Beatrice's personal accounts, her remaining trust funds, and every asset she owned to satisfy the massive debt she had proudly guaranteed. The countdown was moving rapidly now. Every passing hour brought them closer to total, inescapable ruin. I picked up the pen and began signing the final documents Harrison had prepared, officially securing my offshore trust and ensuring my newly acquired financial independence remained absolutely untouchable. The cold, calculating forensic accountant was fully in control, meticulously finalizing the last details of the most complex, devastating audit I had ever conducted. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, the dark clouds parting to let a few sharp rays of sunlight pierce through the gloom. I finished signing the last page and handed the thick folder back to Harrison. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the impending destruction settling comfortably in the quiet room. I looked at the digital clock on my laptop screen. It was Wednesday morning. 2 days left. 2 days of them drinking my wine, throwing away my books, and planning a party that would end in handcuffs and federal indictments. I picked up my phone, opening the calendar app. I blocked out Friday evening, labeling the time slot with a single simple word: reckoning. Friday evening arrived with a chill that swept off Lake Michigan, but inside the Gold Coast estate, the atmosphere was suffocatingly warm and dripping with excess. Beatrice had spared absolutely no expense for what she officially dubbed the divorce and engagement gala. Valets in crisp white jackets hurried down the long circular driveway, parking a continuous stream of Bentleys, Porsches, and imported sports cars. Inside the massive foyer, the harsh, bright lighting Lexi had demanded illuminated a towering ice sculpture carved into the shape of a broken chain link, a nod to my finalized divorce. A live string quartet played pop songs in the corner of the formal living room, attempting to lend an air of classical sophistication to an incredibly tacky celebration. The elite of Chicago high society milled about the expansive rooms, holding crystal flutes filled with vintage champagne that I had sourced and purchased 3 years ago from a vineyard in France. Waiters in black ties glided smoothly through the packed crowd, offering silver trays loaded with beluga caviar, truffle-infused hors d'oeuvres, and gold leaf-decorated desserts. Beatrice stood near the grand marble fireplace, draped in a heavy emerald silk gown and wearing a diamond necklace that sparkled blindingly under the new sterile lights. She was holding court with a tight circle of wealthy socialites, her voice carrying easily and intentionally over the music. She laughed loudly, tilting her head back, bragging to anyone who would listen about how they had finally excised the charity case from their prestigious bloodline. She boasted that her son was finally upgrading to a much better class of woman, gesturing broadly toward Lexi with her champagne flute. Lexi was busy taking selfies near the sweeping mahogany staircase, wearing a skin-tight white sequined dress. Bradley stood next to his new fiancée, looking flushed with expensive alcohol and unearned victory. He was actively accepting hearty pats on the back from his fellow corporate executives, who loudly congratulated him on shedding his boring number-crunching ex-wife. I observed this sickening display of arrogance through the massive front windows before I even set foot on the stone porch. I had arrived in the back of the dark-tinted Maybach, instructing Harrison and the driver to park discreetly just beyond the glare of the valet station. I did not look anything like the defeated, broken woman who had dragged a single black suitcase out of this house just 3 days ago. Tonight, I wore a perfectly tailored, striking crimson suit that projected absolute, undeniable authority. My posture was rigid, powerful, and unyielding. My hair was pulled back into a sleek, severe style that left my face completely exposed and unreadable to my enemies. In my right hand, I held a single thick manila envelope. It was the final piece of physical mail that had been forwarded to my temporary office address, an official highly urgent notice from the Federal Tax Board addressed directly to Bradley. It was the absolute perfect prop for my final performance. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked up the long, familiar driveway. The cold air felt bracing and purifying against my skin. The valets ignored me, assuming I was just another late-arriving guest joining the festivities. I bypassed the main entrance line and pushed open the heavy mahogany front doors myself. The immediate wave of loud laughter, clinking glasses, and upbeat string music washed over me like a physical force. I stepped onto the imported Italian marble floor of the foyer, the sharp click of my crimson heels cutting through the ambient noise with rhythmic precision. For a moment, nobody noticed my arrival. The guests were entirely too absorbed in their own self-important conversations and the free-flowing alcohol to pay any attention to the front door. I stood perfectly still in the center of the grand entryway, right next to the melting ice sculpture, and simply waited for the inevitable reaction. It took exactly 40 seconds for Beatrice to spot me. Her booming laughter died abruptly in her throat. Her eyes widened in pure, unfiltered shock, which was quickly replaced by a dark, vicious, and bubbling fury. She whispered something sharply to the woman standing next to her, and a ripple of sudden, profound silence began to spread outward from the fireplace. The string quartet, noticing the sudden awkward shift in the room's energy, faltered on their instruments and slowly stopped playing altogether. The abrupt silence in the mansion was deafening. 200 of Chicago's wealthiest residents simultaneously turned their heads to stare at the uninvited ex-wife standing in the foyer. Bradley pushed his way aggressively through the gathered crowd, his face flushing a deep, angry crimson that clashed horribly with his expensive suit. Lexi trailed closely behind him, holding up her smartphone, immediately pressing record to capture the impending confrontation for her internet audience. Bradley stopped 5 feet away from me, crossing his arms tightly over his chest, trying to physically intimidate me with his physical presence. "What in the world are you doing here?" Vanessa Bradley demanded, his voice echoing loudly and aggressively in the quiet room. "You have absolutely no right to be on this property. The judge gave this house to me. I own everything you are standing on. Are you really so pathetic and desperate that you have to crash my engagement party just to beg for a financial handout?" A few of his executive friends snickered loudly from the back of the room, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Beatrice marched forward, positioning herself right next to her son, her chest heaving with supreme indignation. "I knew it," Beatrice announced to the crowd, pointing a sharply manicured finger directly at my face. I knew the charity case would come crawling back the moment she realized she had nothing. Look at her showing up uninvited to a high society event where she clearly does not belong. "We threw you out in the trash where you belong, Vanessa. Did you run out of your meager settlement money already?" Do we need to call private security to physically remove you from the premises, or will you save yourself the ultimate public humiliation and walk out that door on your own 2 feet before things get ugly? Lexi stepped forward, pointing her phone camera directly at my face. This is so incredibly embarrassing for you. Lexi sneered, her voice dripping with toxic condescension. You are literally obsessed with us. Bradley upgraded to a younger, hotter, much more successful model. You need to pack up your boring little calculator life, move on, and stop stalking my future husband. The crowd murmured in agreement, exchanging amused and highly judgmental glances. They viewed me as a desperate, scorned woman making an absolute fool of herself in high society. They bought entirely into the false narrative Bradley and Beatrice had eagerly sold them. In their eyes, I was the boring, inadequate accountant who had been rightfully discarded by a brilliant tech visionary. They waited eagerly for me to scream, to cry, or to throw a dramatic, unhinged fit. I did not give them the satisfaction of a single emotional reaction. I stood my ground firmly, my expression a mask of absolute chilling calm. I looked at Bradley, taking in his flushed face and arrogant, wide stance. I looked at Beatrice, noting the greedy, malicious gleam in her eyes as she clutched her expensive jewelry. I looked at Lexi, who was desperately trying to manufacture viral drama for her digital followers. I let their harsh insults hang heavily in the air, allowing the profound silence to stretch until it became intensely uncomfortable for the spectators. The longer I remained completely silent, the more their aggressive posturing began to look incredibly weak, defensive, and hollow. I am not here to crash your pathetic party, Bradley, I said, my voice perfectly level and projecting clearly across the massive, silent room. I have absolutely zero interest in spending my Friday night surrounded by people who actively fund their lavish fake lifestyles with stolen money. Bradley flinched slightly, a rapid, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. He thought I was just making a bitter, generalized insult. He had absolutely no idea how terrifyingly literal my statement was. I am simply here to drop off the last piece of mail that was accidentally forwarded to my new office. I continued smoothly, my tone entirely conversational. I lifted my right hand and extended the thick manila envelope toward his chest. It looks incredibly important. It bears the official, highly visible seal of the Internal Revenue Service. I thought you would want to receive it immediately, given your new, highly publicized sole responsibility for all corporate financial matters. Bradley snatched the envelope from my hand, ripping it out of my grasp with unnecessary aggressive force. He did not bother to open it. He just crumpled the thick paper slightly in his fist, glaring at me with raw, undisguised hatred. You are completely insane, he spat, his voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper meant only for my ears. You came all the way here to play a glorified postman. Get out of my house right now before I have you officially arrested for trespassing. I gave him a slow, knowing smile that reached all the way to my eyes. I turned my steady gaze to Beatrice, who was glaring at me with unbridled, toxic venom. I am leaving, I assured them, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying authority that made Beatrice take a tiny step backward. I just wanted to see the look on your faces one last time, while you still thought you were untouchable. Enjoy the vintage champagne, Beatrice. It is the very last expensive vintage you are going to drink for a very long time. I turned around gracefully, my crimson suit stark and brilliant against the white marble floor, and walked back toward the mahogany doors. I did not rush my exit. I took slow, measured, powerful steps, feeling the eyes of 200 wealthy guests burning into my back. I pushed the doors open and stepped out into the cool night air, leaving them to their doomed celebration. The stage was perfectly set. The arrogant audience was gathered. The final, devastating act was about to begin. I watched the entire room turn to follow the direction of his trembling finger. 200 high society guests, his frantic mother, his terrified mistress, and a dozen federal agents all shifted their gaze to where I stood in the open doorway. The icy Chicago wind whipped around my crimson suit, but I remained perfectly planted, entirely unbothered by the sudden intense focus. I did not run. I did not attempt to defend myself against his hysterical accusations. I simply maintained eye contact with the lead IRS investigator, a silent, knowing communication passing between us that Bradley's frantic, collapsing mind could not possibly comprehend. Special Agent Miller did not even turn around to look at me. He kept his cold, analytical gaze locked entirely on my ex-husband. The agent slowly reached back into his sleek leather portfolio. He did not pull out a pair of handcuffs for me. Instead, he pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing a fresh, heavy ink stamp from the Chicago family court. It was the exact same settlement binder Bradley had so gleefully signed just 3 days ago. "That is an interesting accusation, Mr. Vance." Special Agent Miller stated, his voice projecting a terrifying absolute calm across the silent room. However, the federal government relies strictly on signed, legally executed documentation rather than the frantic deflections of a cornered suspect. Bradley stopped his pacing. His manic laughter died instantly in his throat. He stared at the familiar black leather binder in the agent's hand, a sudden cold realization beginning to dawn behind his bloodshot eyes. "Are you familiar with Schedule C of your finalized divorce decree?" the agent asked, holding the document up for Bradley to see. "Because according to this specific attachment which you signed, and a judge verified, you explicitly demanded 100% total control of the tech investment firm. But more importantly, you signed an assumption of total liability clause." The blood drained completely from Bradley's face. He took a stumbling step backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping slightly on the spilled champagne covering the marble floor. "In this clause, Special Agent Miller continued reading directly from the highlighted text, you legally assumed sole retroactive responsibility for all corporate debts, all financial discrepancies, and all federal penalties associated with this entity. You explicitly and legally indemnified Ms. Vanessa from all corporate actions taken prior to the date of this decree." Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He looked desperately at the high-priced corporate friends who had been cheering for him just 10 minutes ago. They were all staring at the floor or looking away, completely abandoning him to his fate. He looked at Lexi, who was currently backing away toward the kitchen doors. Her phone lowered her eyes wide with the realization that the man funding her luxury lifestyle was officially broke and heading to federal prison. "You begged a family court judge to make you solely responsible for this company," the agent stated, snapping the binder shut with a definitive thud. "The federal government is simply honoring your aggressive legal request. You claim the throne, Mr. Vance. Now you get to pay the toll." Bradley shook his head weakly, his hands dropping to his sides. "But I didn't read it," he whispered, his voice cracking, shedding the last remnants of his arrogant facade. "My lawyers told me to sign it. I didn't read the attachment." Special Agent Miller signaled to 2 heavily armed FBI agents standing near the entrance. "Ignorance of the contract you forced your wife to sign is not a valid federal defense," the agent replied coldly. "You wanted 100% of the assets. Congratulations. You also get 100% of the indictments. You are coming with us." The 2 FBI agents stepped forward seamlessly, grabbing Bradley by the arms and spinning him around with forceful, practiced efficiency. The harsh metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed sharply through the grand foyer. It was a beautiful, deeply satisfying sound. Bradley let out a pathetic, strangled sob as they secured his arms behind his back, completely breaking down in front of the entire Chicago elite he had tried so hard to impress. "No!" Beatrice suddenly shrieked, breaking her horrified silence. She lunged forward from the fireplace, her emerald silk gown swishing violently as she tried to reach her son. "You cannot do this. He is a brilliant man. This is a massive mistake. I will hire the best defense lawyers in the entire state of Illinois. I will spend every single dime I have to utterly destroy that vindictive woman standing in the doorway and clear my son's prestigious name." Special Agent Miller turned his attention to Beatrice. He did not look intimidated by her wealth or her screaming threats. He looked at her with the weary patience of a man who dismantles fake empires for a living. "Ma'am, I highly advise against making threats against a federally protected whistleblower," the agent stated, his tone dropping to a low warning register. "But more importantly, You might want to reconsider your legal budget. Beatrice stopped in her tracks, her chest heaving with indignant rage. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice shrill and aggressive. I am Beatrice Vance. I have generational trust funds. I will bury your entire department in endless litigation. The IRS agent pulled a secondary notice from his portfolio. Actually, Mrs. Vance, you do not have generational trust funds anymore. We have completely audited your financial profile. You have been entirely dependent on your son's embezzled cash flow for the past 3 years. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her chest, clutching her diamond necklace as if the agent had physically struck her. The surrounding high society guests began whispering furiously among themselves, witnessing the complete humiliating exposure of her fake pedigree. Furthermore, the agent continued raising his voice to ensure every single person in the room heard the fatal blow. As part of this raid, all of your son's assets have been immediately frozen. This includes the massive predatory commercial loan he secretly took out against the specific Gold Coast property, a loan that you personally co-signed to help him secure the fraudulent capital. Beatrice's eyes widened in sheer unadulterated horror. She looked at Bradley, who was currently weeping softly while being held by the federal agents. He could not even look his mother in the eye. Because the primary accounts are frozen, that commercial loan is now in total default, the agent explained with brutal mechanical precision. As the legal CO signer, you are entirely personally liable for the remaining balance. The bank has already initiated swift foreclosure proceedings on this house. Additionally, to satisfy the massive outstanding debt, federal authorities have officially seized your personal bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and any remaining liquid assets bearing your name. Beatrice swayed on her expensive heels. She reached out to steady herself against the melting ice sculpture, her pristine manicured hands slipping on the wet, freezing surface. You have absolutely nothing left, Mrs. Vance, the agent, concluded, delivering the final crushing reality. Please, step away from the catered caviar. This property is now under federal lockdown. I stood in the doorway watching the absolute destruction unfold exactly as I had mathematically predicted. I had not laid a single finger on them. I had not raised my voice. I had simply stepped aside and let the sheer crushing weight of their own monumental hubris pull them entirely under the surface. They had dug their own graves, built their own coffins, and eagerly nailed the lids shut with their own expensive fountain pens. Lexi, seizing the moment of maximum chaos, finally made her move. The moment she fully comprehended that Bradley was completely broke and heading to a federal penitentiary, she dropped her fierce loyalty instantly. She did not look back at the man who had bought her the luxury penthouse. She did not offer a single word of comfort to the weeping, handcuffed executive. She simply turned on her heel and literally ran out the back kitchen doors, desperate to escape the blast radius of a seized bank account. The federal agents began aggressively clearing the grand foyer, shouting orders for the wealthy guests to vacate the premises immediately. The elite of Chicago did not need to be told twice. They practically trampled each other in their desperate haste to reach the valet station, fleeing the radioactive scene of a federal financial crime. The string quartet packed their expensive instruments and sprinted out the side exit. I stepped backward off the stone porch, letting the cold rain wash over me as the guests poured out of the front doors. I watched as the FBI agents marched Bradley out of the house in handcuffs. His custom-tailored suit was rumpled, his head hung in total, pathetic defeat. He looked small, weak, and entirely broken. He did not look like a visionary. He looked exactly like what he was. A common thief who had finally run out of other people's money. Beatrice was escorted out shortly after him, flanked by 2 female agents. She was not wearing her heavy emerald silk gown with pride anymore. She clutched her arms around herself, shivering in the cold night air, having been ordered to leave behind her expensive jewelry and her oversized designer handbag, which the agents had rightfully seized as evidence of items purchased with stolen funds. She looked directly at me as they guided her down the driveway. Her eyes were completely hollow, devoid of the toxic superiority that had defined her entire miserable existence. I gave her a single slow, perfectly polite nod. I turned around gracefully and walked back to the waiting Maybach. The driver opened the heavy door for me. I slid into the warm, quiet interior, taking my seat next to my mother and Harrison. Miriam handed me a fresh glass of chilled vintage champagne. The bubbles fizzed sharply in the quiet, insulated space. I looked out the tinted window as the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, leaving the ruined Gold Coast estate and the flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles far behind in the rearview mirror. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive champagne. The war was officially over, and the victory tasted absolutely flawless. The catered caviar sitting on the silver tray suddenly seemed incredibly unimportant. Beatrice froze her hand, hovering over the delicate blinis. The absolute certainty of the federal agent's words struck her like a physical blow. The elegant high society facade she had meticulously maintained for decades fractured instantly. Her eyes darted around the grand foyer, seeking a friendly face, seeking the wealthy executives who had been toasting her son just moments ago. But those executives were already backing away, practically melting into the expensive wallpaper. Nobody wanted to be standing near ground zero of a massive federal financial crime. Special Agent Miller did not break eye contact with Beatrice. He stepped forward, entering her personal space with the same aggressive dominance she had used on me in the dining room when she stole my grandmother's silver. The dynamic had shifted entirely. Your country club memberships, your luxury vehicles, the offshore trust funds you thought were hidden. Special Agent Miller listed his voice devoid of any emotion, keeping his tone strictly professional. All of it is currently locked down. The bank initiated the default protocols 20 minutes ago when the corporate accounts were officially seized. Your personal financial exposure is absolute. Beatrice's mouth opened and closed silently. The heavy diamond necklace resting against her chest seemed to physically weigh her down, a glittering symbol of the stolen wealth that was rapidly vaporizing. She looked at Bradley, her golden boy, the genius visionary who was supposed to elevate their family to the highest echelons of Chicago's elite. Bradley was currently hunched over, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, crying openly in front of the very people he had tried so desperately to impress. "You cannot do this!" Beatrice finally shrieked, her voice cracking, breaking the suffocating silence of the foyer. "This is a misunderstanding. My son is a brilliant businessman. We are victims here." That woman? She pointed a trembling finger at me, standing calmly in the open doorway. "That woman set us up. She manipulated the paperwork." Special Agent Miller did not even turn to look at me. He kept his attention focused entirely on Beatrice and Bradley. "The federal government does not operate on conspiracy theories, Mrs. Vance," he stated firmly. "We operate on paper trails, certified wire transfers, and legally binding contracts signed by consenting adults in a court of law. Your son eagerly signed a document claiming total financial responsibility. You eagerly co-signed a toxic commercial loan to fund a lavish lifestyle. The federal government is simply executing the consequences of those arrogant, highly illegal decisions." The two FBI agents holding Bradley began to guide him toward the front doors. Bradley dragged his feet, his expensive loafers scraping against the pristine Italian marble. He looked up, his bloodshot eyes finding mine. The smug, untouchable grin was completely gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated terror. Vanessa, Bradley begged, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of his corporate pride. "Please, you have to tell them. You built the accounts. You know how the money moved. You have to explain it to them." I stood perfectly still in my crimson suit. I looked at the man who had dismissed me as a glorified calculator, who had stolen millions to fund his 23-year-old mistress, who had demanded custody of my dogs just to hurt me. I looked at him and felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, no satisfaction. Just the cold, mechanical reality of a closed ledger. "I did explain it to them, Bradley," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent room. "I explained every single wire transfer, every offshore shell company, and every fake marketing expense. The federal agents found my forensic accounting to be incredibly accurate." Bradley's eyes widened in sheer horror as the realization finally crashed down upon him. The anonymous whistleblower, the airtight evidence, the perfectly timed raid. It was all me. I had not just stepped aside, I had meticulously built the entire trap, baited it with his own massive ego, and handed the detonator to the federal government. The agents pulled him forward, forcing him to walk through the heavy mahogany doors he had slammed in my face just 3 days ago. He stumbled out into the freezing Chicago rain, his head bowed, his reputation utterly destroyed. Beatrice lunged forward, trying to follow her son, but a female IRS agent stepped smoothly into her path, blocking her exit. Mrs. Vance, the agent said, producing a separate set of documents from her portfolio. We need to discuss the immediate seizure of your personal assets to satisfy the defaulted commercial loan. We will need you to surrender the keys to the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway, as well as any high-value items purchased with the embezzled funds. Beatrice looked down at her emerald silk gown, at the heavy diamond necklace, at the oversized designer handbag clutched tightly in her hands. The reality of her situation was finally penetrating her thick layer of generational arrogance. She was not just losing her social standing, she was losing her entire identity. Lexi, who had been completely forgotten in the chaos, suddenly bolted. She had dropped her smartphone, abandoning her live stream, and sprinted toward the back kitchen doors. She was moving with the desperate speed of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. She did not grab her designer coat. She did not check on the man she had planned to marry. She simply ran, desperate to escape the blast radius of a seized bank account and a massive federal indictment. The remaining high society guests did not wait for formal dismissal. The moment Bradley was marched out the front doors, the elite of Chicago turned into a stampeding herd. They shoved past each other, practically knocking over the melting ice sculpture in their frantic haste to reach the valet station. Nobody wanted to be photographed near the scene of a major financial crime. Nobody wanted to be associated with the Vances anymore. They fled into the cold night, leaving their half-empty champagne flutes and untouched caviar behind. I stepped backward off the stone porch, giving the fleeing guests plenty of room to escape. I watched the chaos unfold with the detached precision of an auditor reviewing a finalized report. The math was perfectly balanced. The liabilities had been officially transferred. The accounts were closed. I turned gracefully and walked down the long, sweeping driveway toward the waiting black Maybach. The heavy rain had stopped, leaving the Chicago air crisp and clean. The flashing red and blue lights of the federal vehicles illuminated the limestone facade of the Gold Coast estate, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows across the property Bradley had fought so aggressively to steal. Harrison stood by the open door of the Maybach, holding an umbrella, though it was no longer necessary. He offered a small, respectful smile as I approached. A flawless execution, Harrison noted quietly as I reached the vehicle. The federal agents have everything they need. The commercial loan default is officially registered. Beatrice's accounts are frozen. I nodded, stepping into the warm, luxurious interior of the car. My mother Miriam was waiting inside, holding 2 crystal flutes. She handed one to me, her dark eyes shining with an intense, quiet pride. She did not say a word. She did not need to. We had won the war, and we had done it without firing a single shot. The driver closed this heavy door, sealing us inside the quiet, insulated cabin. I leaned back against the plush leather seat, taking a slow, deliberate sip of the vintage champagne. The crisp, dry liquid tasted like pure, unadulterated freedom. As the Maybach pulled smoothly away from the curb, merging into the downtown traffic, I looked out the tinted window at the towering skyscrapers. The city of Chicago was exactly the same as it had been this morning, but my place within it had shifted entirely. I was no longer the quiet, dutiful wife managing a fake empire. I was the architect of my own absolute independence. The federal raid was just the beginning of their nightmare. Bradley would face decades in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud and embezzlement. His reputation in the financial sector was permanently annihilated. Beatrice would face complete financial ruin, stripped of her fake pedigree, and forced to navigate a world without stolen money to shield her from reality. Lexi would vanish into obscurity, searching for another wealthy target, leaving Bradley with absolutely nothing. The trap had sprung perfectly, snapping shut with the definitive crack of a judge's gavel. They had demanded total control. They had demanded 100% of the assets. I had simply given them exactly what they asked for, meticulously bound in the inescapable chains of federal liability. I set my empty champagne flute in the silver holder between the seats. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a fresh, pristine legal pad. I uncapped my fountain pen, the smooth metal cool against my fingers. "What is next?" Miriam asked, breaking the comfortable silence of the car. I looked down at the blank page, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. "I am going to build a new firm," I replied, my voice steady and powerful. "There are a lot of wealthy, arrogant men in this city hiding their assets from the women who actually built their empires. I think it is time someone helped those women follow the money." The black Maybach glided seamlessly through the illuminated city streets, carrying me away from the wreckage of my past and directly into the brilliant, meticulously calculated future I had built entirely on my own terms. The numbers always tell the truth. You just have to know exactly where to look. The morning after the federal raid, the financial world woke up to a seismic shockwave. I sat at the kitchen island of my new ultra-modern penthouse, sipping freshly brewed coffee while watching the local news network scramble to cover the spectacular collapse of Bradley Vance. The reporters had obtained exclusive footage from a neighbor's security camera, and it was playing on a continuous, humiliating loop. It showed the exact moment the handcuffs came out in the grand foyer. Lexi, wearing her skin-tight white sequined dress, did not stand by her man. The footage captured her sprinting out the back kitchen doors and tearing across the manicured lawn as fast as her designer heels could carry her. According to the leaked police reports as she ran, she was screaming at the top of her lungs that she had absolutely no idea he was broke. She abandoned her expensive coat and her luxury handbag in the hallway, terrified that the federal agents would seize them as physical evidence of stolen funds. The panic setting in was absolute and completely merciless. By noon the next day, Lexi realized her own severe legal exposure. The luxury penthouse apartment she had bragged about online had been leased using the embezzled corporate capital. The IRS immediately froze her personal checking accounts to audit any financial gifts she had received. She had completely scrubbed her social media accounts, deleting every single photograph, video, and mention of Bradley to distance herself from the radioactive fallout. She posted a tearful, heavily filtered apology video, claiming she was an innocent victim of his masterful manipulation and that she was taking extended time away to heal from the severe emotional trauma of dating a massive fraud. She packed up her influencer lighting equipment and vanished from the Chicago scene entirely, leaving Bradley to face the full devastating wrath of the federal government completely alone without a single ally in his corner. Bradley's legal reality shifted from arrogant denial to sheer unadulterated panic within 48 hours. I received daily updates from Harrison, who monitored the federal docket with profound professional satisfaction. Bradley's initial team of high-priced, aggressive corporate lawyers completely abandoned him the very moment they realized his bank accounts were frozen and his massive retainer checks would absolutely bounce. They explicitly refused to take his panicked phone calls from the holding facility. He was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who had zero patience for his entitled executive tantrums or his relentless demands for special treatment. During his arraignment hearing at the federal courthouse, Bradley looked nothing like the untouchable tech visionary who had smugly demanded my house and my dogs just days prior. He wore a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, his hair unwashed and disheveled, his shoulders slumped in total pathetic defeat. The prosecution presented the airtight dossier I had anonymously provided, highlighting the complex web of Delaware shell corporations and illicit offshore wire transfers that fueled his fake lifestyle. When the public defender requested bail, arguing that Bradley was a respected community leader with deep ties to the city, the federal prosecutor simply laughed out loud in the crowded courtroom. They argued successfully that a man with established international shell accounts and a proven history of massive financial deception was the ultimate flight risk. The judge agreed without hesitation. Bail was categorically denied. Bradley was remanded immediately to federal custody, forced to trade his luxury Gold Coast lifestyle for a concrete cell, a cold metal toilet, and a highly regimented daily schedule where his arrogant demands meant absolutely nothing. He was entirely stripped of his power, his wealth and his freedom left in complete isolation, to calculate the decades he would inevitably spend behind bars. While Bradley sat shivering in a federal holding facility, Beatrice experienced a rapid, brutal descent into absolute financial ruin. The commercial bank holding the toxic loan did not waste a single second. Because Beatrice had proudly co-signed the agreement to secure her son's fraudulent capital, she was held entirely liable the moment the federal asset freeze triggered the default clause. On Monday morning, bank representatives arrived at the Gold Coast estate, accompanied by local law enforcement officers, to serve the official foreclosure and eviction notices. Beatrice attempted to flee the suffocating public humiliation by seeking refuge at her prestigious exclusive country club in the northern suburbs. She marched up to the dining room podium, demanding a prime table and a stiff drink to soothe her frayed nerves. Instead, the club manager quietly informed her that her membership had been permanently revoked due to insufficient funds and the highly public nature of her family's criminal scandal. When she threw a screaming fit, demanding respect, and citing her generational wealth, security guards physically escorted her off the pristine manicured lawns. She was officially a social pariah. By Wednesday, the bank completed the swift eviction process. Harrison forwarded me a photograph taken by a legal clerk monitoring the property seizure. It showed Beatrice standing on the exact same wet sidewalk where she had gleefully locked me out just a week prior. She was wearing the same crumpled emerald silk gown from the ruined party, clutching a single small suitcase containing whatever basic clothing the federal agents had allowed her to keep. Her heavy diamond necklace and oversized designer handbag were gone, seized as evidence of items purchased with stolen client funds. She stood there looking utterly pathetic, furiously dialing the numbers of her wealthy society friends to beg for a place to stay. Every single one of those desperate calls went straight to voicemail. She was forced to walk to a public bus stop, dragging her small suitcase through the freezing rain, completely abandoned by the high society world she had worshipped her entire miserable life. The relentless media coverage of the Vance family collapse dominated the Chicago news cycle for the entire following week. Every major financial publication published scathing exposes on Bradley's fraudulent tech investment firm, detailing how he had brazenly funneled millions of dollars from hard-working clients to fund an egregious, fabricated lifestyle. Investigative journalists dug deep into Beatrice's background, publicly exposing the uncomfortable truth that her so-called generational wealth was entirely imaginary, built entirely on predatory loans, and her son's active embezzlement. The public humiliation was absolute and inescapable. Former associates, business partners, and country club friends rushed to give exclusive interviews, eagerly distancing themselves from the disgraced family and claiming they had always suspected something was horribly wrong with Bradley's meteoric rise to power. The federal government seized all remaining physical assets connected to the fraudulent enterprise. The luxury European vehicles were towed from the driveway of the Gold Coast estate on live television. The expensive artwork, custom furniture, and vintage wine collections were meticulously catalogued and auctioned off by federal liquidators to provide partial restitution to the defrauded investors. The fake billionaire empire Bradley and Beatrice had so arrogantly flaunted was dismantled piece by piece, sold to the highest bidder, and erased from the elite social registries forever. Amidst the spectacular destruction of their fake empire, there was one final crucial piece of business I needed to resolve immediately to ensure my total victory. Bradley had demanded primary custody of my two rescue dogs, Buster and Luna, purely as a sadistic tactic to break my spirit during the divorce proceedings. He wanted to use them as emotional leverage, assuming I would eventually beg and pay him massive sums of money to get them back. He severely miscalculated my meticulous record-keeping and my fierce protective instincts. Harrison filed an emergency motion with the family court on Tuesday morning. He presented the original adoption paperwork from the animal shelter, comprehensive veterinary bills, and city registration tags. Every single document proved unequivocally that I had adopted both dogs under my maiden name 3 years before I ever married Bradley. They were legally classified as my separate premarital property, completely exempt from any marital asset division. Furthermore, Harrison submitted undeniable evidence of Bradley's current federal incarceration, proving he was physically incapable of providing care for the animals, alongside reports that the foreclosed property was currently without power or heat due to unpaid utility bills. The judge reversed the custody order immediately, signing the release authorization without requiring a formal hearing or extended legal debate. That afternoon, a specialized animal transport service arrived at the foreclosed estate. They bypassed the strict bank auditors and retrieved Buster and Luna from the dark, cold laundry room where Bradley had locked them during his disastrous party. When the transport van finally arrived at my new high-rise penthouse, I dropped to my knees on the gleaming hardwood floor. Buster, a scruffy terrier mix, and Luna, a gentle golden retriever, bolted out of their crates and crashed directly into me, covering my face in frantic, joyful kisses. I buried my face in their soft fur, holding them tightly against my chest. Tears of genuine relief finally falling freely from my eyes. The massive weight I had been carrying for 4 grueling months completely evaporated in that beautiful moment. The last remaining pieces of my heart were finally safe secured and exactly where they belonged. The brutal equation I had so carefully calculated was now perfectly balanced. My enemies were entirely vanquished, my future was bright, and my family was completely whole again. The transition into my new reality was incredibly smooth. My ultra-modern penthouse sat perched high above the bustling Chicago streets, a fortress of glass, steel, and untouchable financial security. I had purchased the sprawling multi-million-dollar property using the legally protected, entirely untraceable private funds I had safely secured in the Cayman Islands Trust months before Bradley even filed for divorce. The space was completely devoid of the heavy, suffocating mahogany and depressing gray tones of the Gold Coast estate. Instead, it featured soaring 20-foot ceilings, brilliant natural light, and sleek minimalist furniture that reflected my own clear, unburdened state of mind. Buster and Luna were currently asleep on the heated marble floors of the living room, their soft breathing the only sound in the quiet, peaceful sanctuary. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon, exactly 3 weeks after the federal raid that dismantled Bradley's fraudulent empire. I was sitting at my pristine glass dining table reviewing the initial incorporation documents for my brand new business venture. The sharp, unexpected buzz of the private intercom system broke my deep concentration. I pressed the communication button, expecting a delivery confirmation from the lobby concierge. Instead, the building manager spoke, his voice laced with clear hesitation and professional discomfort. He informed me that a woman was standing in the lobby demanding to be allowed up to my private floor. She did not have an appointment, and she was causing a significant scene. He told me she claimed to be my mother-in-law and that it was an absolute family emergency. I did not panic. I did not feel a single spike of anxiety. I simply instructed the concierge to send her up, warning him to have building security stand by the elevators, just in case she refused to leave voluntarily. I walked calmly toward the heavy steel front door of my penthouse, smoothing the front of my tailored navy trousers. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, ready to witness the final pathetic remnants of the Vance family pride. Beatrice stood in the brightly lit hallway, and the sheer physical transformation was genuinely staggering. The haughty diamond-draped matriarch, who had terrorized me for a decade, was completely gone. The woman standing before me looked incredibly haggard, drastically aged, and entirely broken by her rapid descent into absolute poverty. Her perfectly styled hair was flat and unwashed, showing stark gray roots she could no longer afford to maintain at an exclusive salon. She was not wearing her emerald silk gown or her tailored Chanel suits. She wore a cheap, ill-fitting beige trench coat that looked like it had been pulled from a discount rack. Her hands were empty. The oversized designer handbags and the blinding diamond tennis bracelets had all been seized by federal agents to satisfy her defaulted commercial loan. She looked exactly like what she had always mocked, a desperate common woman with absolutely nothing to her name, Vanessa. Beatrice gasped, her voice cracking immediately as she saw me standing in the doorway. She took a step forward, her hands reaching out in a desperate, trembling gesture of supplication. "Thank God you are here. I did not know where else to go. The banks took absolutely everything. They took my home, my accounts, my retirement funds. I have been sleeping on a terrible cot in my sister's unfinished basement for 2 weeks, and now she is kicking me out because the federal investigators keep showing up at her house to ask questions about my finances." I stood perfectly still, blocking the entrance to my home. I did not invite her inside. I did not offer her a glass of water. I looked at her with the cold, detached precision of an auditor reviewing a bankrupt account. Beatrice's eyes darted past my shoulder, taking in the sweeping views and the luxurious interior of my penthouse. The stark realization that I had successfully secured massive, untouchable wealth, while she had completely lost hers, hit her like a physical blow. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to swallow every last ounce of her generational pride. "Please, Vanessa." Beatrice begged, genuine tears spilling over her eyelashes and cutting tracks through her cheap, unblended makeup. "You have to help me. You clearly have the financial resources. I just need a small loan to secure a modest apartment and hire a decent defense attorney for Bradley. The public defender is completely incompetent, and they are threatening to move Bradley to a maximum security federal facility. We are entirely destitute. You cannot just leave us to rot in the streets. We are still family. We are still a family." The sheer audacity of her statement hung heavily in the quiet hallway. She had stood in my dining room and slapped my face. She had tried to steal my grandmother's silver. She had laughed out loud in a court of law while attempting to strip me of my home, my business, and my beloved dogs. And now, stripped of her stolen wealth and facing the brutal consequences of her own monumental greed, she dared to invoke the sacred concept of family to extract a financial bailout. I looked directly into her desperate, bloodshot eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream or hurl insults. I simply reflected her own toxic, arrogant reality perfectly back onto her. "We are not family." "Beatrice," I stated, my voice dropping to a smooth, chilling, and entirely emotionless whisper. "We were never family. You made that abundantly clear the moment you decided I was just an unfortunate phase your brilliant son was going through. You made your choices, and you eagerly co-signed a fraudulent loan to fund a fake lifestyle. The federal government is simply collecting the debt you proudly guaranteed." Beatrice sobbed loudly, her shoulders shaking with genuine pathetic terror. "But I have absolutely nothing," she wailed, clutching the lapels of her cheap coat. "I do not know how to survive like this. You know how to manage money. You know how to fix financial disasters. You built Bradley's entire firm. You can figure out a way to shield some of my assets from the IRS. You have to save us." I tilted my head slightly, observing her total collapse with absolute clinical detachment. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring she hung on every single syllable of my final judgment. "I cannot help you, Beatrice," I said, maintaining perfect, unyielding eye contact. My words were measured, deliberate, and devastatingly precise, mirroring the exact insults she had so confidently hurled at me on the day of my eviction. "I am just a glorified calculator, a forensic accountant. I sit in a dark office and look at spreadsheets all day. I lack the pedigree required to navigate the upper echelons of Chicago society. I do not have the brilliance, the charisma, or the grand vision necessary to save your son from a federal penitentiary. Bradley is the visionary. He is the one with the brilliant mind. I am sure his unparalleled business instincts will serve him incredibly well while he trades cigarettes in the prison cafeteria for the next 20 years. Beatrice froze. The tears stopped falling. Her mouth hung open in an expression of pure, unadulterated horror as she finally completely understood the absolute finality of her destruction. She recognized her own cruel, arrogant words being used as the precise nails sealing her financial coffin. She realized in that crushing moment that there would be no mercy, no bailout, and absolutely no forgiveness. The charity case she had so gleefully abused had meticulously engineered her total annihilation. "I am very busy today, Beatrice." I concluded, my tone entirely polite and dismissive. I highly suggest you leave the premises immediately before I ask the building security to physically remove you for trespassing. I did not wait for her to formulate a response. I stepped back and closed the heavy steel door firmly in her face. The deadbolt slid into place with a loud, definitive click. The absolute silence of the penthouse instantly enveloped me, pure safe and completely untainted by her toxic presence. I did not look through the peephole to watch her leave. I simply turned my back on the hallway and walked away, leaving Beatrice Vance to face the cold, unforgiving reality of the poverty she had so deeply despised. I walked through the expansive sunlit living room, pausing only to gently pet Buster and Luna as they stretched lazily on the warm marble floor. I opened the massive sliding glass doors and stepped out onto the sprawling private balcony. The icy wind off Lake Michigan whipped my hair around my face, but the cold felt brilliantly refreshing. I walked to the edge of the glass railing, looking out over the magnificent sprawling expanse of the Chicago skyline. The city looked beautiful, vibrant, and full of endless, untouchable potential. I had survived the fire, and I had emerged from the ashes completely unscathed, holding the absolute keys to my own kingdom. The soft sound of footsteps echoed on the stone tiles behind me. My mother Miriam stepped out onto the balcony, wrapping a thick cashmere shawl around her shoulders against the biting wind. She moved to stand beside me at the glass railing, holding two crystal flutes filled with expensive vintage champagne. She handed one to me, her dark eyes shining with an immense quiet pride that needed no verbal explanation. "Did she finally leave?" Miriam asked, her voice carrying a calm, satisfying certainty. "She is gone," I replied, taking the cold crystal glass from her hand. "And she is never coming back." Miriam nodded slowly, turning her gaze out toward the towering skyscrapers reflecting the late afternoon sun. She took a slow sip of her champagne. "I reviewed the final incorporation papers you left on the dining table," she noted casually. "The new business structure looks absolutely flawless. You have completely insulated the liability protocols." I smiled, leaning my forearms against the cool glass railing. I had officially launched my own elite forensic accounting firm just that morning. I was not going to work for massive corrupt corporations anymore. I had found a much more satisfying, highly lucrative niche. My new firm was strictly dedicated to specializing in high-net-worth divorces, specifically focusing on helping women meticulously track, expose, and legally seize the hidden assets their arrogant, cheating husbands desperately tried to conceal. I was going to use my brilliant, calculating mind to ensure that no other woman in Chicago would ever be forced to walk out of a courtroom with a single suitcase while her abusers laughed in the gallery. "There is a massive market for absolute truth in this city," I said, watching the headlights of the cars far below navigating the busy city streets. "Men like Bradley always leave a digital paper trail because their massive egos convince them they are entirely invisible. They always assume their wives are too naive, too emotional, or too financially illiterate to understand the mechanics of their greed." Miriam clinked her crystal flute gently against mine, the crisp sound ringing brightly in the cold air. To the glorified calculators of the world, my mother toasted, a sharp, knowing smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. May they always be drastically underestimated until the very moment they drop the final ledger. To the final ledger, I echoed, taking a long, deeply satisfying sip of the vintage champagne. I stood on the balcony overlooking the empire I had reclaimed, feeling the absolute, undeniable surge of true power coursing through my veins. True power does not scream from a courtroom gallery. True power does not wear heavy diamond necklaces bought with stolen money or throw lavish parties to celebrate fake victories. True power sits quietly in the shadows. It observes every weakness. It calculates every variable. It meticulously drafts the paperwork, and it waits with infinite, terrifying patience for the arrogant to eagerly sign their own absolute ruin. The numbers never lie, and the final equation was perfectly, flawlessly balanced. If my journey from a crowded, humiliating courtroom to the balcony of my own penthouse has taught me anything, it is that true power rarely ever raises its voice. For years, I allowed my ex-husband and his mother to diminish my contributions, writing me off as nothing more than a glorified calculator. They truly believed that loud arrogance, designer clothes, and a fake social pedigree were the ultimate measures of strength. But arrogance is a blinding vulnerability. It creates a false sense of invincibility that makes people careless, greedy, and eager to sign legal documents they haven't even bothered to read. The greatest lesson I can share is this: never underestimate the profound power of quiet competence. In a world that constantly tells women to shrink themselves or accept less than they deserve, your absolute greatest weapon is your knowledge. Understand your personal worth, but more importantly, fully understand your finances. Know exactly where your money comes from, where it goes, and who is holding the liability. When you are financially literate, you are fundamentally unmanipulable. You do not need to scream, throw fits, or fight back when toxic people try to tear you down. You simply need to establish airtight boundaries and let their own monumental hubris do the heavy lifting for you. Let them deliberately mistake your silence for weakness. Let them drastically underestimate your intelligence. Because while they are busy throwing lavish parties to celebrate their fake victories, you can be meticulously drafting the blueprint for your own unshakable independence. The numbers never lie, and the final equation will always balance itself out if you have the patience to see it through. Please share your own experiences of quietly taking back your power from toxic people in the comments below. If this journey of turning a calculated betrayal into an absolute triumph resonated with you, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of women fiercely reclaiming their independence. Remember, the finest print always holds the ultimate power.